My name is Chelsea, and I am 33 years old. My husband stood over my medical bed and announced that 9 members of his family were moving into our house for 2 weeks starting today. When I begged him to postpone because I had just undergone major spinal surgery 3 days ago, he dropped a stack of heavy bath towels directly onto my healing legs and coldly told me to sit on a bar stool and cook them dinner. But what he did not know was that I had just seen the terrifying messages on his tablet. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to people who underestimated your worth. For years, I thought I had built a successful and stable life. I work as a senior corporate auditor for a major firm in Seattle. I had a demanding but rewarding career, a beautiful house in an upscale suburb, and a marriage that I believed was built on mutual respect. I was tragically mistaken about that last part. The reality of my situation hit me with brutal force on a rainy Tuesday afternoon. Just 3 days prior, I had undergone a grueling L4 to L5 spinal fusion surgery. The doctors had warned me that the recovery would be one of the most painful experiences of my life, and they were not exaggerating. I was essentially trapped in a rigid plastic brace that encased my entire torso, lying in a rented hospital bed that we had set up in the middle of our spacious living room. Every slight movement sent bolts of white-hot agony radiating down my legs and up my spine. I was entirely dependent on a specialized metal walker just to make the agonizing trip to the bathroom. The surgeons had strictly forbidden me from lifting anything heavier than a glass of water, warning that any strain could cause the titanium screws in my spine to shift and paralyze me permanently. I was vulnerable, exhausted, and heavily medicated. I was staring blankly at the ceiling, trying to breathe through a fresh wave of nerve pain when the heavy oak front door slammed open. My husband Bradley stormed into the house. He did not ask how I was feeling. He did not bring me a glass of water or check if I needed my medication. Instead, he marched directly over to my medical bed, carrying a massive stack of freshly laundered bath towels. Without a single word of warning, he dropped the heavy stack directly onto my shins. I gasped as the sudden weight sent a shockwave of pain straight up into my fused vertebrae. I clutched the safety rails of the bed, tears springing to my eyes as I tried to process the sudden agony. Bradley did not even flinch at my reaction. He just stood there adjusting his expensive designer watch and looked down at me with an expression of pure irritation. My mother, my sister Courtney, and 7 other relatives are landing at the airport in exactly 2 hours, he announced, his voice completely devoid of warmth. They are staying here at the house for the next 2 weeks. You need to get up and get the guest rooms ready. I stared at him in absolute disbelief. For a moment, the physical pain was entirely eclipsed by the shock of his words. Bradley, what are you talking about? I managed to whisper, my voice trembling. I just had major spinal surgery. I cannot even walk to the kitchen without the frame. You cannot bring 9 people here right now. Please tell them they have to postpone until next month. Bradley crossed his arms over his chest and rolled his eyes, letting out a loud, theatrical sigh. Stop playing the victim, Chelsea. He scoffed, his tone dripping with condescension. You have been lying in that bed for 3 days straight. You are perfectly capable of getting up. My family has been looking forward to this trip for months, and I am not going to ruin their vacation just because you have a backache. A backache? I had literally had my vertebrae fused together with titanium screws and rods, and he was calling it a backache. Bradley, I am on heavy narcotics, I pleaded, trying to keep the panic out of my voice. I cannot host anyone. I cannot clean the house. I cannot entertain your mother. You do not have to entertain them, he snapped back. You just have to do your basic duties as a wife. You can easily pull one of the tall bar stools up to the kitchen island and sit there while you prep dinner. It is not that complicated. Just chop some vegetables and put a roast in the oven. My family expects a nice home-cooked meal when they arrive. The sheer cruelty of his demands left me speechless. I looked at the man I had married 5 years ago and wondered how I had ever missed this terrifying lack of empathy. But as he continued his tirade, the underlying resentment that had been poisoning our marriage finally bubbled completely to the surface. My family deserves a luxury vacation, Bradley sneered, pacing back and forth at the foot of my medical bed. After you selfishly refused to help pay for Courtney's destination wedding in Cabo last year, this is the least you can do to make it up to them. They are my family, which means they are entitled to enjoy the benefits of this house just as much as you are. His words revealed a deep, festering entitlement that I had been willfully ignoring. When we first got married, Bradley made significantly less money than I did. I was the primary breadwinner, bringing in a massive corporate salary while he bounced between entry-level management jobs that he could never seem to keep for more than a few months. I had purchased this sprawling suburban home entirely with my own money, utilizing an irrevocable trust fund that my late grandfather had established for me long before I even met Bradley. My grandfather had warned me to protect my assets, ensuring that my house was legally untouchable. Bradley's name was nowhere on the deed, a fact that had always secretly bruised his fragile ego. Yet he constantly bragged to his friends and his family that he had bought this magnificent property, claiming my generational wealth as his own personal achievement. I refused to pay for your sister's wedding because she demanded $50,000 for a beachfront resort party and expected me to drain my retirement accounts to fund it. I replied, my voice gaining a fraction of its usual strength despite the pain. That was my savings, Bradley, not a communal vacation fund for your relatives. It is family money, he shouted, his face turning red. When you married me, your resources became our resources. My mother and sister have been treated like second-class citizens by you for years just because you think your corporate job makes you better than us. Well, for the next 2 weeks, they are going to live like royalty in this house, and you are going to make sure they have everything they need. I realized then that there was absolutely no reasoning with him. He had orchestrated this entire invasion specifically when I was at my most vulnerable. He wanted to force me into a position of servitude, to stroke his own ego and appease his demanding mother and sister. Bradley grabbed his car keys from the console table and headed toward the door. I am leaving for the airport now, he threw over his shoulder. The guest bathrooms better be spotless, and that dinner better be in the oven by the time we pull into the driveway at 5. Do not embarrass me, Chelsea. With that, he walked out of the house, slamming the heavy front door so hard that the windows rattled in their frames. The silence that followed was suffocating. I lay there in the medical bed, the stack of heavy towels still pressing painfully against my shins, completely overwhelmed by a mixture of physical agony and emotional betrayal. I was trapped. I could barely sit up independently, and within 2 hours my home was going to be invaded by 9 people who openly despised me. The throbbing in my lower back intensified a sharp burning sensation that demanded immediate attention. I gritted my teeth and reached awkwardly toward the small side table next to my bed, blindly searching for the orange plastic bottle of prescribed narcotic painkillers. My fingers brushed against something smooth and metallic. It was Bradley's tablet. He had been using it earlier that morning to check his emails and must have forgotten it in his rush to leave for the airport. As my hand knocked against the device, it slid across the polished wood of the table and clattered onto the floor. The impact woke the screen, casting a bright, harsh glow across the dim living room. I leaned over the edge of the safety rail, wincing as the rigid plastic of my back brace dug into my ribs, trying to see if the screen had cracked. It was not broken, but the notification glowing brightly in the center of the locked screen completely paralyzed me. The tablet was synced to Bradley's phone messages, and a new text had just popped up from a family group chat. The chat was titled, "The Estate Transfer." My breath caught in my throat. I stared at the bright white text bubble, my mind struggling to process the words displayed on the screen. It was a message from Barbara, my mother-in-law. The preview text read exactly as follows. Do you have the quitclaim deed printed out and ready in the folder? Make sure she takes her heavy painkillers as soon as we get there. She will sign anything when she is loopy and cannot read the fine print. We need to get that house transferred today. The room seemed to spin around me. The pain in my spine faded into the background, entirely eclipsed by a sudden freezing wave of adrenaline. This was not a poorly timed family vacation. This was not just Bradley trying to punish me for not paying for his sister's wedding. This was a calculated, malicious ambush. They were bringing 9 people to create chaos and confusion. They were planning to drug me with my own post-operative narcotics. They intended to use my vulnerable medicated state to trick me into signing a quitclaim deed, legally transferring the ownership of my grandfather's multi-million-dollar property directly into their hands. I stared at the glowing screen on the floor, the reality of my husband's absolute treachery sinking deep into my bones. He had planned to steal my home, my sanctuary, while I was literally paralyzed in a medical bed. He thought I was weak. He thought I was subdued by the pain and the medication. He thought I would be an easy target. But Bradley had severely miscalculated. He forgot that before I was a patient recovering from surgery, I was a senior corporate auditor. I spent my entire career dismantling financial frauds and destroying people who tried to hide their dirty secrets in the fine print. I did not reach for my painkillers. I did not cry. Instead, I carefully pulled myself up the metal rods in my back, aching with every millimeter of movement. I reached for my own cell phone resting on the pillow beside me. The clock on the screen read exactly 3 in the afternoon. I had 2 hours before Bradley and his army of thieves arrived at my front door. 2 hours to turn their trap into their absolute destruction. I gripped my phone, my knuckles turning white as I forced myself to ignore the burning sensation radiating down my spine. There was no room for tears and absolutely no time for panic. I had spent my entire professional life auditing corrupt corporations, identifying vulnerabilities, and executing flawless contingency plans. Now, I was going to audit my own marriage. I opened my contacts and made 3 rapid, hushed phone calls. The first call was to the emergency commercial locksmith I had kept on retainer for my office building. I offered him triple his usual emergency rate to drop whatever he was doing and get to my address in the next 20 minutes. I told him I needed the core mechanisms of every single exterior door on the property completely swapped out. The second call was to a premium private post-operative medical transport service. I explained my physical condition and demanded an immediate emergency evacuation to an exclusive medically supervised recovery retreat in downtown Seattle. I told the dispatcher to send their most discreet team and to bypass the main roads. The third call was to my private wealth manager. I needed absolute confirmation that the irrevocable trust my grandfather had established remained a fortress. As my manager assured me that the deed to my sprawling suburban home was entirely secure and locked behind layers of legal protection, my mind flashed back to the countless arguments Bradley and I had endured over this very house. Bradley had always harbored a deep-seated toxic resentment toward my financial independence. He constantly complained to his family that he felt emasculated living in a house he did not legally own. Yet, whenever we hosted dinner parties with his friends, he would stand in the center of the custom kitchen and loudly brag about how he had bought this magnificent property. He loved the status my money gave him, but he despised the fact that I held the keys. His fragile ego could never handle the reality that my generational wealth was not a communal asset meant to serve his relatives. With the calls made, I faced the most agonizing task of all. I had to pack. I gripped the handles of my specialized metal walker and pulled myself upright. The movement sent a blinding flash of white-hot pain through my fused vertebrae. I bit down on my lower lip so hard I tasted blood, refusing to cry out. Inch by excruciating inch, I dragged myself across the hardwood floor toward my home office. I grabbed a small, nondescript duffel bag from the closet. I did not care about clothes or toiletries. I was packing for a war. I carefully loaded my encrypted financial hard drives, the physical copies of my trust documents, and a small velvet lockbox containing my late grandfather's heirloom jewelry. Every time I bent my knees or shifted my weight, my spine screamed in protest, but the image of Bradley and his mother plotting to drug me kept me moving forward. Just as I zipped the duffel bag closed and leaned heavily against my walker to catch my breath, my cell phone vibrated violently against the desk. The caller ID flashed brightly. It was Barbara calling from the airport baggage claim. I took a deep, steadying breath. I needed to perform the role of a lifetime. I needed them to walk blindly into the trap they thought they had set for me. I answered the phone intentionally, letting my voice sound weak, slurred, and heavily medicated. "Hello," I murmured, letting out a soft, manufactured groan of pain. "Chelsea. Listen to me closely." Barbara barked aggressively through the speaker. not offering a single word of greeting or asking how my surgery went. We just landed and Bradley is getting the rental van. I need you to make sure the guest rooms have extra hypoallergenic pillows on the beds. Courtney has sensitive skin, and she cannot sleep on those cheap down feathers you usually use. And make sure there are 3 bottles of the good white wine chilling in the fridge. Do you hear me? I gripped the edge of the walker, my fingernails digging into the metal. The sheer audacity of this woman demanding luxury accommodations while actively plotting to steal the roof over my head was astounding. I hear you, Barbara, I replied, pitching my voice to sound dizzy and confused. I just took my heavy painkillers like Bradley told me to. I am feeling really sleepy, but I will make sure everything is exactly as you deserve when you arrive. Good, Barbara snapped, sounding immensely satisfied that her plan to drug me was already working. Have the paperwork Bradley mentioned out on the kitchen island. We have some things to go over when we get there. Just rest until we arrive. She hung up without another word. I dropped the phone back into my pocket, a cold, predatory smile spreading across my face. She wanted me compliant. She was going to get a ghost. Less than 10 minutes later, the commercial locksmith pulled into the driveway. He was a seasoned professional who asked no questions. He worked with blistering speed, systematically removing the smart lock cylinders and the physical deadbolts from the front door, the back patio doors, and the garage entry. He replaced them all with high-security commercial-grade locks that could not be bumped or picked. I paid him in cash, took the only 2 copies of the new keys, and watched him drive away. My house was now an impenetrable fortress. Moments after the locksmith departed, the private medical transport van arrived. 2 highly trained paramedics gently transferred me from my walker onto a comfortable, stabilized stretcher. They moved with incredible care, ensuring my rigid back brace remained perfectly aligned as they wheeled me out of the front door and down the driveway. As they secured me into the back of the spacious transport van, I looked back at the sprawling suburban home. It was a beautiful property surrounded by manicured lawns and tall evergreen trees. It was the sanctuary my grandfather had secured for me, a place that was supposed to be safe. Bradley had tried to weaponize my own home against me. He had tried to invite wolves into my sanctuary. The paramedics closed the rear doors of the van, plunging me into a quiet, climate-controlled environment. The vehicle began to move, pulling smoothly out of the neighborhood and heading toward the exclusive medically supervised recovery retreat in the heart of downtown Seattle. I lay safely on the transport stretcher, the physical pain in my back finally beginning to dull as a sense of absolute triumph washed over me. I reached into my bag and pulled out my smartphone. I opened the dedicated smart home application that controlled the security systems of my property. The app provided me with crystal-clear, high-definition live camera feeds of the driveway, the front porch, and the perimeter of the house. I watched the screen intently as the minutes ticked by. Exactly at 5 o'clock in the afternoon, right on schedule, a massive, overloaded rented passenger van turned into my driveway. I watched through the digital feed as the heavy doors of the van slid open. Bradley stepped out first, looking incredibly arrogant and puffed up with false confidence. He was followed by his mother Barbara, clutching a thick leather folder that undoubtedly contained the fraudulent quitclaim deed. Then came his sister Courtney, who was already holding up her phone, loudly recording a social media video to brag to her followers about the free luxury resort she was about to enjoy for the next 2 weeks. 7 other extended relatives poured out of the van behind them, stretching their legs and pointing excitedly at my beautiful home. They looked like conquerors arriving to claim their spoils. I stared at the screen, my thumb hovering over the master control panel on my app. I initiated the total digital lockdown. I disabled the smart locks, deactivated the garage door openers, and armed the perimeter security sensors. I watched as Bradley confidently marched up the front steps, leading his eager family toward the entrance. He punched his personalized master code into the digital keypad on the front door. The keypad flashed a bright, angry red. Bradley stopped, a look of mild confusion crossing his face. He laughed nervously, turning back to say something to his mother, and tried punching the code in a second time, pressing the buttons harder. The keypad flashed red again. I lay in the back of the transport van, watching the live feed as his arrogant smile completely vanished. He pulled his physical backup key from his pocket and shoved it into the deadbolt, trying to force it to turn. The key would not budge. The locks had been entirely changed, the digital access wiped clean, and the house was sealed tight. From miles away, heading toward a luxurious recovery suite, where I would be treated with actual dignity and care, I watched the chaos begin to unfold on my screen. Barbara stepped up to the porch, throwing her hands in the air and visibly shouting at Bradley, her face twisting in anger. Courtney lowered her recording phone, looking embarrassed and confused. The other relatives stood in the driveway, surrounded by their massive piles of luggage, staring at a front door that would never, ever open for them. Behind him, the initial excitement of his 9 exhausted relatives was rapidly souring into vocal irritation. They had just endured a long, cramped flight and an uncomfortable ride in a rented passenger van. They were expecting to be ushered into a pristine, luxurious suburban sanctuary where I would be waiting to serve them a hot, multi-course meal. Instead, they were standing shivering in the damp Seattle evening air, surrounded by a mountain of oversized luggage, staring at a locked door. Courtney, who had been holding her phone high to broadcast her grand arrival to her social media followers, slowly lowered her arm. The performative, boasting smile on her face melted into an ugly scowl. She aggressively tapped the screen of her phone to end her live recording, clearly humiliated that her grand display of borrowed wealth had been interrupted by a locked door. I could see her mouth moving as she complained to her mother, gesturing wildly at the heavy suitcases scattered across my manicured driveway. Barbara stepped forward aggressively, shoving her way past a bewildered cousin to stand directly behind Bradley. Through the audio feed of the security camera, her shrill, demanding voice came through crystal clear. "Bradley, what on earth is taking so long?" she barked, wrapping her thick coat tighter around her shoulders. "We are freezing out here. I need to use the restroom, and your sister has a migraine coming on. Open the door right now." Bradley's shoulders hunched defensively. He was absolutely terrified of looking weak in front of his overbearing mother. He hit the keypad again, slapping the numbers with the flat of his palm. "I do not know what is wrong with it," he stammered, his voice rising in pitch. "The code is not working. Chelsea must have messed with the security settings when she was playing around on her phone. I told you she was heavily medicated. She probably accidentally triggered some kind of lockdown protocol because she is too incompetent to understand how the smart home system operates." It was almost comical how quickly he defaulted to blaming my intelligence. Even when faced with a locked door, his fragile ego demanded that he frame me as a bumbling, confused woman rather than admit he had absolutely no control over the situation. Barbara let out a dramatic, disgusted sigh that was loud enough for the entire neighborhood to hear. She turned away from the porch and began pacing down the front walkway, waving her arms in exaggerated exasperation. "Unbelievable," she shouted to no one in particular. "This is exactly what I warned you about, Bradley. You give that woman an ounce of responsibility, and she completely ruins everything. We fly all the way across the country to spend time with our family, and your foolish wife manages to lock us out of your own house." Her loud, grating voice echoed down the quiet suburban street. Next door, I saw my neighbor, Mrs. Gable, step out onto her front porch, pulling her cardigan tight as she peered over the manicured hedges to see what the commotion was. Barbara immediately spotted an audience and marched right up to the property line. "Can you believe this?" Barbara complained loudly to my bewildered neighbor. "My son bought this beautiful, massive house for his ungrateful wife, and she is so heavily medicated and useless that she locked us out in the cold. We are just trying to have a nice family vacation." I lay in the back of the medical transport van, shaking my head at the sheer, unadulterated delusion. My grandfather had purchased that house. My hard-earned corporate salary maintained it. Bradley had not contributed a single dime to the property taxes, the maintenance, or the mortgage. Yet here was his mother standing on my driveway, shouting to my neighbors about her son's imaginary generosity. Mrs. Gable, who knew perfectly well that I was the sole owner of the property because she sat on the homeowners association board with me, just gave Barbara a tight, polite smile and quickly retreated back inside her house, locking her door. She wanted absolutely nothing to do with the circus unfolding on my lawn. Bradley was growing increasingly frantic. The illusion of his wealth and authority was rapidly crumbling in front of the very people he desperately wanted to impress. He began pounding his fist against the reinforced glass of the front door, the heavy thuds vibrating through the audio feed. "Chelsea," he screamed, his voice muffled by the thick insulation of the house. "Chelsea, get off that bed and open this door right now." He thought I was inside. He genuinely believed I was lying in the living room trapped in my medical brace, ignoring his commands. The thought of me actively defying him sent him into a blind rage. He kicked the base of the door, scuffing the expensive paint. The relatives standing behind him were beginning to murmur among themselves, exchanging uncomfortable, irritated glances. A few of the younger cousins had sat down on their suitcases, looking miserable and exhausted. While Bradley continued his pathetic tantrum on my front porch, the private medical transport van pulled smoothly into the covered secure parking garage of the downtown recovery retreat. The contrast between the chaotic, angry scene playing out on my phone screen and the serene, highly professional environment I was entering could not have been more extreme. The doors of the van opened, and I was immediately greeted by a team of specialized nursing staff. They did not bark orders at me or demand that I cook for them. They addressed me by my name, spoke in calm, soothing tones, and carefully transferred my stretcher onto a smooth, gliding hospital trolley. They wheeled me into a private, dedicated elevator that took us straight to the penthouse recovery suite. The suite was magnificent, designed specifically for intensive post-operative healing. It featured a state-of-the-art adjustable orthopedic bed draped in crisp, high-thread count linens. Soft, warm lighting illuminated the spacious room, and massive windows offered a breathtaking view of the Seattle skyline. The nurses gently helped me transition from the transport stretcher into the recovery bed, adjusting the mattress to perfectly support my fused spine. For the first time in 3 days, my body felt entirely supported. The agonizing pressure in my lower back eased slightly as the advanced medical mattress contoured to my rigid brace. A registered nurse checked my vitals, administered my scheduled pain medication through a precise controlled intravenous drip, and placed a call button right next to my hand. I was safe. I was secure. I was entirely untouchable. I settled back against the plush pillows, letting out a long, shuddering breath. I picked up my cell phone again, just as the screen lit up with an incoming call. The caller ID displayed Bradley's name. The photo attached to his contact was one we had taken on a vacation in Hawaii 2 years ago, back when I still believed he was a supportive partner. I stared at his smiling face on the screen, feeling absolutely nothing but a cold, clinical detachment. I was an auditor, and I was about to close the books on this marriage forever. I pressed the green answer button and held the phone to my ear, remaining perfectly silent. "Chelsea, what the hell is wrong with you?" Bradley screamed into the receiver. His voice was raw with fury and deep embarrassment. The audio was so loud I had to hold the phone an inch away from my ear. "I am standing on the front porch with my entire family. We are freezing. We are exhausted. And the smart lock is completely dead. My key is not working. The code is not working. Did you mess with the security hub?" I did not answer immediately. I took a slow, deep breath, relishing the absolute power I held in this exact moment. Through the phone, I could hear Courtney whining in the background, complaining that her feet hurt and she needed a large glass of wine. I could hear Barbara demanding that Bradley break a window if he had to. "Chelsea, answer me right now." Bradley bellowed, his voice cracking with unchecked rage. "Get up off that bed, drag your walker to the front door, and let us in. My mother is out here. Do you have any idea how humiliating this is? If you do not open this door in the next 10 seconds, I swear to God, I am going to rip the control panel off the wall when I get inside. What is the new override code?" I let his empty threats wash over me, completely unaffected. The man screaming on the other end of the line was a coward who had planned to drug me and steal my generational wealth. He deserved no mercy, no explanation, and absolutely no quarter. I adjusted my position against the soft pillows of my luxury recovery suite, gazing out at the beautiful city skyline. I kept my voice incredibly calm, completely devoid of any emotion, letting the chilling, absolute certainty of my words strike him like a physical blow. "Since you insisted on hosting a luxury vacation for your family," I said quietly, articulating every single syllable with razor-sharp precision, You can go ahead and pay for their hotel. The house is completely closed for renovations. Have a wonderful trip, Bradley. I did not wait for his response. I did not give him the satisfaction of hearing my breathing or engaging in a screaming match. I pulled the phone away from my ear and pressed the red button, instantly severing the connection. I dropped the phone onto the bedside table and let my head sink back into the pillows, a cold, victorious smile spreading across my face. I had just locked the wolves out in the cold. Now it was time to watch them turn on each other. I lay back against the plush, supportive pillows of my luxury recovery suite, my eyes locked on the high-definition feed radiating from my smartphone. I had just hung up on Bradley, severing the call with absolute finality. Through the sensitive outdoor microphone of my security cameras, I could hear the exact moment the reality of my chilling words washed over him. He stood completely frozen on my front porch, his phone still pressed tightly to his ear, his mouth hanging slightly open in stunned disbelief. For 5 years, Bradley had operated under the pathetic delusion that I would always fold. He genuinely believed that I would always swallow my pride, ignore his blatant disrespect, and sacrifice my own comfort simply to keep the peace in our marriage. Hanging up on him while he was screaming demands was an act of sheer defiance he simply could not process. I watched the live feed as he slowly lowered his cell phone, staring at the blank screen as if the device itself had physically struck him across the face. The silence on the porch did not last long. Barbara marched up the concrete steps, her heavy winter coat swishing aggressively around her ankles. She slapped her hand against Bradley's shoulder, demanding to know what I had said and why the front door was still locked. When Bradley mumbled that the house was closed for renovations and that I had told him to pay for a hotel, Barbara absolutely erupted. She screamed that my behavior was completely unacceptable. She loudly reminded him that they had flown all the way across the country on a cramped airplane, that they were exhausted, and that he needed to step up and handle his disobedient wife. Courtney stomped her expensive designer boots on the damp pavement, whining about the chilly Seattle air. She loudly demanded access to the primary guest room, claiming she felt entitled to rest in a comfortable bed after such a long journey. The other 7 relatives grumbled in loud agreement, their initial excitement entirely replaced by a wave of entitled vocal outrage. I watched the live camera feed as Bradley's fragile ego completely shattered under the weight of their judgment. He looked at his demanding mother, his whining sister, and his irritated extended family, realizing that his grand illusion of wealth and total control was disintegrating right in front of their eyes. He could not tolerate looking weak. He could not accept being locked out of the castle he falsely claimed to own. He puffed out his chest, his face twisting into an ugly, desperate mask of rage. He loudly declared to his captive audience that I was just throwing a pathetic medicated tantrum. He proclaimed to the dark driveway that he was the man of the house, that he paid for this magnificent property, and that no crazy, irrational woman was going to keep his loving family out in the cold. It was a spectacular performance of toxic masculinity entirely fabricated to save face. Bradley instructed everyone to wait by the front door, promising them he would have them inside sipping expensive wine in less than 5 minutes. He aggressively stomped off the porch and marched around the side of the house, heading directly toward the back patio. With a swift, satisfying swipe of my thumb, I switched the camera feed on my phone to the backyard view. The high-resolution night vision captured his every single move in crisp, undeniable detail. He approached the large, reinforced glass sliding doors that led directly into my custom-designed kitchen. He grabbed the heavy brass handle and yanked it violently, throwing his entire body weight into the motion. But the commercial-grade deadbolt I had just paid a premium to install held absolutely firm. The door did not even rattle. Bradley was completely blinded by his own toxic pride and mounting panic. He turned around in circles, desperately scanning the impeccably landscaped patio for a heavy tool to force his way inside. His frantic eyes landed on a massive, solid cast-iron planter resting near the edge of the wooden deck. My grandfather had gifted me that beautiful planter when I first bought the property. It easily weighed 40 pounds and held a mature, dormant rosebush. Bradley marched over to it, grabbing it by the ornate metal handles. He hoisted it up to his chest, his face straining and turning red from the heavy lifting. He completely ignored the fact that he was about to destroy thousands of dollars worth of custom property. He simply did not care about the damage he was causing to my home. He only cared about proving to his mother that he was in charge. His family, unable to wait patiently at the front door, had followed him around the side of the house. Instead of stopping him from committing a blatant crime, they actually began to cheer him on. Barbara clapped her hands together, yelling at him to break the glass so they could finally get out of the cold. Courtney stood off to the side, nodding in eager agreement, fully believing that they were simply taking back what rightfully belonged to them. They viewed my home as their property, and they felt entirely justified in breaking it open. Encouraged by his toxic cheering audience, Bradley swung the heavy cast-iron planter backward and hurled it directly at the reinforced glass of my patio door. The impact was deafening, even transmitted through the tiny speaker of my cell phone. The heavy iron smashed against the reinforced pane with brutal force. The glass did not shatter completely on the very first hit, thanks to the thick security film I had installed years ago to prevent break-ins. Instead, it spiderwebbed into 1,000 tiny jagged cracks that spread across the entire surface of the door. Furious that his grand display of physical dominance was thwarted by a layer of protective film, Bradley grabbed a heavy metal patio chair and swung it violently at the weakened pane. This time, the glass gave way completely. It exploded inward with a sharp, terrifying crash, showering my pristine kitchen floor with thousands of dangerous, glittering shards. Bradley let out a loud, victorious shout, dropping the metal chair onto the wooden deck. His family actually cheered behind him, entirely convinced that their luxury vacation was finally about to begin. They gathered their bags, preparing to step over the broken glass and make themselves at home in my sanctuary. But Bradley had absolutely no idea what he had just done. He did not know that the exact moment the glass shattered, the sophisticated perimeter security system I had armed earlier had instantly triggered a silent, high-priority alarm. I had specifically linked this comprehensive system directly to the local police precinct during my initial setup years ago. There were no loud, blaring sirens to warn him of his mistake. There were no flashing exterior strobe lights to scare his family away. The house remained perfectly dark and quiet, giving them a false sense of absolute security. Meanwhile, a priority dispatch alert was sent directly to law enforcement, reporting a home invasion in progress at my exact residential address. The system automatically flagged the alert as a critical incident, ensuring an immediate rapid response from the officers patrolling the affluent neighborhood. I lay perfectly still in my warm, supportive recovery bed, ignoring the dull ache in my fused spine. I watched the glorious, spectacular downfall of my arrogant husband unfold in high definition on my small screen. Bradley carefully stepped up to the broken doorframe using the toe of his shoe to kick away the largest shards of glass. He reached his arm through the jagged hole, stretching his fingers toward the interior lock mechanism. He was completely confident that he had won this battle. He bragged over his shoulder to his mother that the door would be open in just a second and that she should go ahead and pick out her favorite guest bedroom. But right as his fingers brushed the cold metal of the new commercial deadbolt, a sudden blinding burst of light illuminated the entire backyard. It was not the motion sensor security lights of my patio. It was the sharp, aggressive, alternating flashes of bright red and blue reflecting fiercely off the siding of my house and the wet pavement of my driveway. 2 police cruisers had pulled silently and swiftly onto the property, their powerful headlights cutting through the dark Seattle evening. They had arrived with blistering speed, responding to the silent alarm with tactical precision. Bradley completely froze. His arm was still sticking awkwardly through the shattered glass door like a trapped animal caught in a snare. The arrogant, confident sneer melted completely off his face, replaced by an expression of pure, unadulterated terror. He slowly turned his head to look over his shoulder, the flashing emergency lights painting his pale face in alternating shades of crimson and blue. Through my phone speaker, I heard the heavy, authoritative thud of a car door slamming shut. A fully uniformed police officer stepped firmly into the backyard, his posture commanding and alert. He rested his right hand securely on his duty belt, assessing the chaotic scene of the broken glass and the group of people huddled on the patio. He pointed a blinding high-lumen tactical flashlight directly into Bradley's panicked, wide-open eyes. The officer did not ask what was happening. He did not ask for an explanation or offer a polite greeting. He raised his voice, the sound cutting through the cold night air with absolute uncompromising authority, and shouted for Bradley to immediately step away from the broken glass and raise his hands where they could be seen. Bradley froze completely. The sharp command sliced through the cold Seattle air, causing his arm to jerk back through the shattered glass of the patio door. He slowly raised his empty hands, turning to face the two police officers who were advancing across the wet lawn. The blinding glare of their tactical flashlights washed over his pale face, highlighting the beads of sweat forming on his forehead. For a split second, I saw genuine panic in his eyes through the high-definition camera feed radiating from my smartphone. He had never been confronted by actual authority before, and the reality of his situation was clearly terrifying him. But Bradley was a master of manipulation. I watched from the safety of my private recovery suite as he took a deep breath, visibly shifting his posture. He dropped the terrified act and puffed out his chest, transforming back into the arrogant, entitled corporate manager he always pretended to be. He lowered his hands slightly, putting on a calm, patronizing smile, as if he were dealing with a minor misunderstanding at a retail store. He confidently marched up to the officers, completely ignoring the jagged glass crunching beneath his expensive leather shoes. "Officers, thank goodness you are here," Bradley called out, his voice dripping with false relief. "You can put the flashlights down. There is no emergency. I am the homeowner. I just had a little accident with the patio door." The lead officer, a tall, broad-shouldered man with a stern expression, did not lower his flashlight. He kept the beam aimed directly at Bradley's chest and firmly instructed him to step completely down from the wooden deck and move into the center of the yard. Bradley sighed heavily, rolling his eyes as if the police were being entirely unreasonable. He slowly walked down the wooden steps, making a show of his compliance. "Look, I can explain everything," Bradley said, deploying his most persuasive professional tone. "My wife is currently inside the house. She just had some minor surgery a few days ago, and she is heavily medicated on prescription painkillers. She gets a little crazy and confused when she takes them. She must have accidentally triggered the security system and locked the smart doors from her phone. She is completely out of it right now." He gestured casually toward the shattered glass on the deck, waving his hand as if breaking a reinforced window was a completely normal household activity. "My mother and my sister just flew in from the East Coast to help take care of her." Bradley continued, pointing to the group of shivering relatives huddled near the corner of the house. "We have been standing out here freezing for 20 minutes. I was just trying to break a small pane of glass so I could reach in and unlock the deadbolt to get my family inside out of the cold. It is my house, so I figured it was the fastest way to handle my wife's little medication mistake. Can you guys go inside and override the alarm panel for me?" Right on cue, Barbara marched across the wet grass to stand beside her son. She adjusted her expensive winter coat and put on her absolute best impression of a victimized, deeply concerned matriarch. "It has been an absolute nightmare, officers," Barbara chimed in, her voice shrill and demanding. "My poor son works so hard to provide this beautiful home for his wife, and she repays him by acting like a complete lunatic. She is severely medicated and clearly not in her right mind. We are exhausted from our flight. Please just force that door open so we can get inside and get her under control. She is probably a danger to herself in there." I lay in my hospital bed across the city, shaking my head at their synchronized lies. They were so incredibly confident in their shared delusion. They genuinely believed that because they wore nice clothes and spoke with authority, the police would simply bow to their demands and help them break into my sanctuary. The lead officer listened to their entire fabricated story in complete silence. He did not nod in understanding. He did not offer a sympathetic smile. He simply stared at Bradley, his expression completely unreadable under the harsh glare of the flashing cruiser lights reflecting off the siding of the house. "Sir," the officer said, his voice flat and authoritative, "I am going to need to see your government-issued identification right now." Bradley scoffed, clearly offended that the officer was not taking his word as absolute truth. He reached into his back pocket, pulled out his leather wallet, and retrieved his driver license. He handed it over with a smug, self-satisfied smirk. "Here you go," Bradley said proudly. You will see the address matches perfectly. Like I said, this is my property. Now, if you do not mind, we have a mess to clean up on the patio. The lead officer took the plastic card and shined his flashlight directly onto it. He read the name and the address, then handed the license to his younger partner. The second officer silently took the card and walked swiftly back down the driveway toward the parked police cruisers. Bradley turned to look at his mother, giving her a confident, reassuring wink. He genuinely thought he had won. He thought the police were just running a routine background check and would be back with a crowbar to help him pry open my back door in a matter of minutes. Courtney even pulled her phone back out, preparing to start a new social media broadcast about how her brave brother was handling the local authorities and taking back his house. I watched the screen of my smartphone intently. I knew exactly what was happening inside that police cruiser. The second officer was typing Bradley's information into the county property records database on his mobile terminal. He was pulling up the legal registry for the lot, the house, and the security grid. I had spent thousands of dollars in legal fees years ago to ensure that the irrevocable trust my grandfather established was listed as the sole, absolute owner of the estate. The trust documents clearly named me as the only authorized beneficiary and primary resident. Bradley's name did not exist anywhere in those digital files. The minutes stretched on. The cold Seattle wind whipped through the backyard, causing the relatives to shiver violently. Bradley's confident smirk began to waver slightly as the silence stretched from 2 minutes into 5. He shifted his weight awkwardly, crossing his arms over his chest to ward off the chill staring down the driveway at the flashing police lights. Finally, the second officer stepped out of the cruiser. He walked back up the driveway, his face completely stony, and handed a digital tablet to the lead officer. The lead officer looked at the glowing screen, scrolled down the page with his index finger, and then slowly raised his eyes to meet Bradley's. "Sir," the lead officer said, his tone entirely devoid of the respect Bradley felt he was owed. "Are you claiming that you are the legal owner of this residential property?" "Of course I am." Bradley snapped, his frustration finally breaking through his polite facade. "I bought this place 5 years ago. I pay the bills. I am the man of the house. Why are we still having this conversation? My family is freezing out here." The officer stepped forward, closing the distance between them. The flashing red and blue lights illuminated the sudden sharp tension in the yard. "Well, sir, we have a significant problem here," the officer plainly stated, his voice ringing out loudly enough for every single relative to hear perfectly. "According to the official county legal registry and the state property tax records I am looking at right now on this terminal, this property does not belong to you. It belongs to a private trust." Bradley's face went completely slack. The color drained from his cheeks so fast he looked physically ill. He opened his mouth, but no sound came out. "That is a mistake," Bradley finally stammered, his voice suddenly weak and high-pitched. "We are married. What belongs to my wife belongs to me. It is marital property. The system just has not updated my name yet." The officer shook his head, his expression hardening into a look of absolute zero tolerance. "That is not how a private trust works, sir. You are not listed on the deed. You are not listed as a trustee. You are not listed on the security provider network that triggered the alarm. Under the law, you are legally considered a tenant at this address, nothing more." Barbara gasped loudly, covering her mouth with her hand. Courtney lowered her phone, staring at her brother in absolute shock. The other 7 relatives exchanged horrified glances. Bradley had spent years convincing them that he was a wealthy, successful homeowner. Now a police officer was standing in the yard, publicly exposing him as a mere tenant living in a house he had absolutely no claim to. The profound humiliation radiating from Bradley was palpable even through the small screen of my phone. He opened his mouth to argue, to spin another web of lies, but the officer cut him off instantly. "Let me be incredibly clear with you." The officer continued, his hand returning to rest heavily on his duty belt. "Since you are not the legal owner of this property, you have no legal right to alter it, damage it, or force entry into it. You just threw a heavy iron planter through a reinforced glass door that does not belong to you. You just committed felony vandalism and attempted breaking and entering on a secured property." Bradley took a sudden, staggering step backward, raising his hands defensively. No, you do not understand. My wife is inside. She is trying to lock me out because of her medication. I do not care if you think your wife is inside, the officer barked, taking a step forward to match Bradley's retreat. The property owner has actively secured the premises and engaged the alarm system. If you attempt to touch that door again, if you even step foot back onto that wooden deck, I will put you in handcuffs, and you will spend the night in a holding cell. Do you understand me? Bradley was completely shattered. The arrogant corporate manager was gone, replaced by a terrified, humiliated coward. He looked at the stern faces of the officers, then looked back at his mother and sister. They were staring at him with a mixture of profound embarrassment and furious betrayal. He had promised them a luxury vacation, and instead he had nearly gotten himself arrested for a felony while exposing his massive financial lies. Yes, Officer Bradley whispered, looking down at the wet grass in total defeat. I understand. Then I suggest you gather your belongings and your guests and vacate the premises immediately, the officer commanded, shining his flashlight toward the driveway. We will remain here until you are entirely off the property. The next 10 minutes were a spectacular display of absolute defeat. Threatened with immediate arrest, Bradley was forced to turn around and face his 9 furious relatives. He mumbled a pathetic apology, telling them to grab their heavy suitcases. I watched in total satisfaction as they dragged their luggage back down the long driveway, their shoes splashing through the cold puddles. Barbara was muttering angrily under her breath, refusing to even look at her son. Courtney was furiously texting on her phone, entirely stripped of her glamorous vacation content. Bradley loaded the suitcases into the back of the rented passenger van, in complete suffocating silence. The police cruisers sat idling at the curb, their bright spotlights illuminating his every shameful move. He was essentially being escorted off my property like a common criminal. He climbed into the driver's seat, his hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. As the heavy van finally pulled away from the curb, driving off into the dark Seattle night to hunt for a cheap, last-minute roadside motel, my cell phone vibrated violently against my hospital bed. A new text message from Bradley illuminated the screen. It was not an apology. It was a venomous, desperate threat from a cornered rat. The text read exactly as follows. I am draining the joint savings account right now to rent a beachfront villa. You are paying for this. I read the message twice, the cold smile returning to my face. He still thought he had a card to play. He still thought he could reach into my pockets to save his fragile ego. I locked my phone and set it on the nightstand, settling back into my comfortable, medically supervised bed. He was heading straight into my financial trap, and I was going to let him trigger it all by himself. I lay in my hospital bed, staring at the ceiling and smiling at the absolute predictability of my husband. Bradley was a creature governed entirely by his own fragile ego. Whenever he felt small or humiliated, his immediate reflex was to spend money to forcefully project an image of supreme power and control. He had just been escorted off my property by the local police in front of his entire extended family. He was drowning in profound embarrassment. To salvage his perceived status as the wealthy provider he needed to perform a grand, highly expensive gesture, he desperately needed to buy their respect back immediately. Through the location sharing feature that I had carefully left active on our shared cellular plan, I watched his digital icons speed away from my quiet suburban neighborhood. He was not driving his shivering, exhausted family toward a reasonably priced roadside motel near the airport. Instead, he merged onto the highway and headed straight toward the affluent waterfront district of downtown Seattle. He was making a beeline for the most exclusive luxury short-term rental agency in the entire city. 3 years ago, Bradley had thrown a massive tantrum about financial equality in our marriage. He aggressively complained that keeping our finances entirely separate made him feel like a mere roommate rather than a respected husband. To appease him and stop the endless arguments, I agreed to open a single joint savings account. However, the financial reality of that account was heavily skewed. Bradley deposited a meager $500 from his logistics job. The very next day, I deposited a massive 6-figure corporate bonus I had earned from a grueling international audit. For 3 years, Bradley treated the existence of that high balance as his own personal safety net, constantly checking the banking application on his phone, just to admire the 6-figure number. He loved knowing the money was there, falsely believing he had equal unrestricted access to my hard-earned wealth. But I was a senior corporate auditor. I made a living by identifying risks and securing assets long before a crisis ever occurred. The day before my spinal fusion surgery, when I first noticed Bradley acting unusually secretive and demanding about my recovery timeline, my professional instincts flared. I quietly contacted my private wealth manager. Under the law, I had the absolute right to withdraw the exact amount of my initial deposit without requiring Bradley's consent. I legally transferred 95% of the funds from that joint savings account directly into a secure, private holding account entirely under my name. I left exactly $412 in the joint account. Just enough to keep it open and active, but absolutely useless for grand impulsive gestures. Bradley had absolutely no idea that his digital safety net had been completely vaporized. I pictured him confidently pulling the rented passenger van up to the sleek glass-fronted office of the luxury rental agency. He likely instructed his tired, complaining relatives to wait in the vehicle, promising them that he was going to secure the most magnificent waterfront mansion available. He probably marched through the sliding glass doors of the agency with his mother Barbara and his sister Courtney trailing right behind him, eager to witness his display of wealth. I knew exactly how Bradley operated in high-end establishments. He would have approached the marble reception desk, puffed out his chest, and demanded to speak with the senior booking agent. He would have loudly requested their absolute best immediately available multi-bedroom property, emphasizing that price was not an object for a man of his standing. He wanted a beachfront villa with a private dock, a hot tub, and enough space to accommodate 10 people in total luxury. The rental agent accustomed to dealing with wealthy clients would have politely pulled up the available inventory on her computer screen. She would have shown him a stunning modern property overlooking the Puget Sound. She would have clearly stated the extravagant price. A 2-week emergency booking for a premium waterfront estate, including the massive security deposit, the expedited cleaning fees, and the premium insurance waiver, would easily come to $20,000. Bradley would not have even blinked at the exorbitant figure. In his mind, he was simply going to reach into my pockets and drain the joint savings account to cover the cost. He felt entirely justified in spending $20,000 of my money just to prove to his mother that he was a successful, generous man. I imagined him casually pulling out his shiny metal debit card linked directly to our joint account. He would have handed it to the rental agent with a smug, self-satisfied smirk, eager to watch her swipe the card and finalize the transaction. He probably turned to look at Barbara and Courtney, waiting for their expressions of awe and gratitude. But the moment the agent inserted the chip into the card reader, the machine would have instantly responded. The digital system would process the request, search the severely depleted joint account, and immediately return a hard, unforgiving decline code. I knew the exact sequence of events that would follow. The rental agent would maintain her polite, professional demeanor. She would discreetly slide the metal card back across the marble desk, softly informing Bradley that the transaction had been declined by his financial institution. Bradley's confident smirk would falter, replaced by a flash of mild irritation. He would undoubtedly blame the bank, loudly claiming that their fraud prevention algorithms must have frozen the card due to the unusually large transaction amount. He would wave his hand dismissively, assuring the agent and his watching family that he could easily resolve the minor inconvenience in a matter of seconds. I lay perfectly still in my recovery bed, staring at the ceiling, waiting for the inevitable notification. I knew Bradley would pull out his smartphone and open his mobile banking application. He intended to initiate a direct, expedited wire transfer straight from the joint savings account to the rental agency's corporate account, bypassing the debit card limits entirely. I watched my own banking app on my phone, monitoring the activity on the shared account in real time. I could vividly picture the scene playing out in the rental office. Bradley tapping aggressively on his phone screen, entering the $20,000 wire amount, and hitting the bright green confirmation button. He expected to see a screen confirming the successful transfer of my money. Instead, a glaring bright red error message would have popped up on his screen. Insufficient funds. Bradley would have blinked, his brain completely short-circuiting as he stared at the bold red text. He would have quickly navigated back to the main dashboard of the banking application, his thumbs shaking as he refreshed the page to check the current available balance. The screen would load, revealing the brutal, undeniable truth. The massive six-figure sum he had been admiring for 3 years was entirely gone. The available balance stared back at him in small, dark numbers. $412. The absolute panic that must have seized him in that exact moment was something I deeply wished I could have witnessed in person. He was standing at the desk of a high-end luxury rental agency, having just demanded their most expensive property. His mother and sister were standing right behind him, expecting to be handed the keys to a beachfront mansion. His other 7 relatives were waiting out in the rain in a cramped passenger van, and he was completely, utterly broke. The rental agent would have cleared her throat, breaking the heavy, suffocating silence in the office. She would ask Bradley if he had an alternative form of payment, perhaps a different account or a premium credit card that could handle the massive $20,000 charge. But Bradley had nothing. His personal credit cards were completely maxed out from his endless attempts to keep up appearances with his wealthy friends. He had absolutely zero liquid assets of his own. His entire financial identity was entirely dependent on my money, and I had just cut the cord. I watched the balance on the joint account remain exactly at $412. The transaction had failed completely. In the rental office, the reality of his total financial ruin would crash down on him like a physical weight. The arrogant corporate manager facade would entirely disintegrate. He would have to slowly lower his phone, his face burning with a profound, inescapable humiliation. Barbara, possessing zero patience and absolutely no social grace, would inevitably step forward. She would loudly demand to know what was taking so long and why they were not already on their way to the villa. She would ask him what the holdup was, her sharp voice echoing in the quiet, sophisticated office space. Bradley would be forced to turn around and look his demanding mother directly in the eye. He would have to open his mouth and admit out loud in front of the rental agent and his sister that the card had declined. He would have to confess that the money was completely gone and that he could not afford to put a roof over their heads. The reaction from his family would be instantaneous and explosive. Barbara would gasp in horror, her face flushing with anger and embarrassment. She had spent the entire flight bragging to the extended family about her son's incredible wealth. Now she was standing in a rental office, realizing her son could not even afford a budget motel room for them. But Courtney would react differently. Courtney was a creature of pure vanity and social media obsession. Realizing that her highly anticipated glamorous luxury vacation was completely dead, her initial shock would instantly twist into vicious, malicious spite. She needed someone to blame for this humiliation, and it certainly was not going to be her beloved brother. She would blame me. Courtney would pull out her smartphone, her face contorting with manufactured grief and genuine malice. Right there in the lobby of the rental agency, she would open her social media application. She would hit the record button, pointing the camera directly at her own face. She would begin filming a tearful, highly dramatic video, fully intending to broadcast a completely fabricated story to her hundreds of followers to completely destroy my personal and professional reputation. I watched the live notification pop up on my phone screen. Courtney had not just filmed a video, she had immediately uploaded it to every major social media platform she used. Her follower count was not massive, but it was highly concentrated within our local community, our mutual friends, and my extended family. I tapped the alert, my face illuminated by the harsh glow of the screen in my quiet private hospital suite. The video started playing automatically. Courtney had perfectly framed herself against the sleek, expensive glass doors of the luxury rental agency. Rain was visibly pouring down in the background, adding a cinematic level of misery to her performance. Her mascara was dramatically smudged beneath her eyes, and she was forcing out ragged, wet sobs that sounded incredibly convincing if you did not know she was a pathological liar. She stared directly into the camera lens, her voice shaking with manufactured grief. "I cannot believe I even have to make this video," she choked out, wiping away a fake tear. "We just flew all the way to Seattle to take care of my sister-in-law, Chelsea. She just had surgery, and she has been acting completely erratic and mentally unstable." Instead of letting us help her, she had a total psychological breakdown. She completely locked us out of the house. She forced my brother, my elderly mother, and our entire family out onto the freezing rain-soaked streets with absolutely nowhere to go. Courtney paused her performance just long enough to let out a loud, pathetic sniffle. She purposely shifted the camera angle to show Barbara huddled in the background, pretending to look frail and freezing. "My brother is doing everything he can to find us a place to stay." Courtney continued, her voice rising in pitch to feign sheer panic. "But Chelsea drained all their money. She took everything. She is committing active elder abuse against my mother and financial abuse against her own husband. Please keep our family in your prayers while we try to survive this nightmare." I sat perfectly still in my orthopedic bed, completely unfazed by the malicious fiction playing out on my screen. I did not feel a single ounce of guilt. I knew exactly what they were trying to do. They had failed to steal my multi-million-dollar property, and they had failed to extort my joint savings account. Now they were executing a coordinated, desperate smear campaign to assassinate my character. They wanted to force me into a corner by turning our entire social circle against me, hoping the public pressure would break my resolve and force me to hand over my money. Within 10 minutes of Courtney posting the video, my cell phone began to vibrate violently on my bedside table. The digital assault was instantaneous and overwhelming. The false narrative had successfully ignited an absolute firestorm of outrage within our shared community. Text messages began flooding my screen in a relentless, unforgiving wave. The first few messages were from mutual acquaintances we often invited to dinner parties. They demanded to know if the video was real, expressing their profound disgust that I could be so incredibly heartless to my own family. A woman I considered a decent friend sent a long, venomous paragraph calling me a cold, calculating monster. She declared she was blocking my number and cutting all ties with me for treating my husband like garbage. Then the calls began to pour in. I ignored them all, letting them drop straight to my voicemail inbox. The notifications stacked up rapidly. Even my own extended family members, people who barely spoke to me throughout the year, felt entirely entitled to insert themselves into the manufactured drama. My phone lit up with a call from my Aunt Patricia. She had always been a deeply passive-aggressive woman who prided herself on maintaining traditional, outdated marital values. When I did not answer, she left a blistering 3-minute voicemail. I listened to the audio playback, my expression completely blank. Patricia sharply scolded me for ruining my marriage. She loudly proclaimed that a good wife is supposed to be supportive and submissive, completely disregarding the fact that I was the sole provider recovering from major spinal surgery. She demanded that I immediately locate my husband, grovel for his forgiveness, and pay for whatever accommodations his family required. I did not reply to Patricia. I did not reply to the angry friends or the outraged acquaintances. I did not type out desperate paragraphs defending my actions or explaining the truth. Engaging with a smear campaign only feeds the fire. Instead, I operated with the cold, methodical precision of a senior corporate auditor, building an ironclad case against a fraudulent entity. I opened my photo gallery and began taking meticulous, high-resolution screenshots of every single defamatory post, every hateful text message, and every vicious comment left on Courtney's video. I saved the audio files of the voicemails to a secure cloud drive. I was actively compiling a massive, undeniable mountain of digital evidence. Every single person participating in this malicious harassment campaign was simply handing me the exact ammunition my high-powered legal team would need to file a devastating defamation lawsuit. They thought they were destroying my reputation, but they were actually digging their own legal graves. While I calmly archived the evidence from the pristine comfort of my downtown recovery retreat, the reality of my husband's situation was taking a decidedly miserable turn. Bradley had been forced to leave the luxury rental office in complete disgrace. With zero cash, a declined debit card, and maxed-out credit limits, he had absolutely no ability to secure a comfortable hotel room for his 9 furious relatives. He had to drive the overloaded passenger van away from the affluent waterfront district, retreating deep into the industrial outskirts of the city. He eventually pulled into the crumbling parking lot of a cheap, run-down roadside motel. The neon vacancy sign flickered aggressively in the dark. It was the absolute bottom of the barrel, the only place willing to accept his exhausted, complaining family for the little pocket cash his relatives managed to scrape together among themselves. They were forced to squeeze 10 angry people into 3 cramped, dingy rooms that smelled faintly of stale smoke and cheap cleaning chemicals. The glamorous, luxurious vacation they had anticipated was entirely dead. Barbara immediately claimed the largest bed in the first room, loudly cursing my name as she threw her designer coat onto a stained armchair. Courtney sat on a lumpy mattress, aggressively scrolling through her social media feed, obsessing over the likes and comments pouring into her defamatory video. Bradley sat alone on the edge of a cheap chair in the adjoining room, staring blankly at the stained carpet. He was completely stripped of his arrogant corporate manager facade. His ego was entirely shattered. He had promised his mother a mansion and delivered a roach motel. He needed to regain control. He needed to find a way to punish me for exposing his profound inadequacy. He pulled his smartphone from his pocket, his thumb aggressively swiping across the screen. He opened his banking application again, futilely hoping the transfer had somehow gone through, but the balance remained an abysmal $412. He closed the app in disgust. As he scrolled through his installed applications, his eyes suddenly locked onto a small blue icon tucked away in a secondary folder. It was an old GPS tracking application. Months ago, Bradley had insisted on installing the tracking software on both of our phones under the guise of marital safety. He had claimed he wanted to ensure I was always safe during my late evening commutes from the corporate auditing office. I knew even then that it was just another pathetic attempt to monitor my movements and exert a false sense of control over my independent life. I had allowed the installation simply to avoid an exhausting, pointless argument, knowing I had absolutely nothing to hide from him. In the chaos of my rapid medical evacuation, disabling the dormant tracking application had been the one detail that slipped my mind. Bradley's thumb hovered over the blue icon. A wicked, desperate gleam returned to his eyes. He tapped the application, holding his breath, as the digital map slowly loaded on his screen. The software sent a ping searching for the signal emitting from my device. A few seconds later, a bright red pin dropped precisely onto the digital map. He zoomed in on the location, his heart pounding with malicious anticipation. The red pin was not located anywhere near our sprawling suburban home. It was not at my corporate office or any of my usual locations. The pin was resting directly over a highly exclusive private medical recovery retreat located right in the heart of downtown Seattle. Bradley stared at the address, a dark, vindictive smile slowly twisting his features. He finally knew exactly where I was hiding. He stood up from the cheap motel chair, his posture straightening as a fresh surge of toxic adrenaline flooded his system. He marched directly into the adjoining room where his mother and sister were loudly complaining about the dreadful accommodations. He held up his phone, showing them the glowing red pin on the digital map. "I found her," Bradley announced, his voice ringing with renewed aggressive confidence. "She thinks she can lock us out and hide in some fancy downtown spa while we rot in this disgusting motel. She thinks she has won." Barbara sat up on the lumpy mattress, her eyes narrowing with malicious intent. Courtney instantly stopped scrolling on her phone, looking up at her brother with eager anticipation. "We are not staying in this dump," Bradley declared, slipping his phone into his jacket pocket. "Get your coats back on. We are going to drive down to that exact address right now. I have medical power of attorney as her husband. We are going to march right into that lobby, drag her out of her comfortable little bed, and force her to transfer the money to pay for our vacation. She is going to learn that she cannot treat this family like garbage." The relatives immediately rallied behind him, their exhaustion completely replaced by a vicious, unified desire for revenge. They grabbed their coats and headed back out into the cold rain, entirely convinced that they were about to storm my sanctuary and reclaim their stolen power. They thought they had the ultimate upper hand. They had absolutely no idea they were driving straight into a devastating corporate ambush. I gripped the padded handles of my customized medical walker. I pulled myself upright, ignoring the sharp twinges of pain radiating from my fused vertebrae. The rigid plastic back brace kept my spine perfectly aligned. I refused to use a wheelchair for this confrontation. I wanted Bradley to see me standing, I wanted him to look me directly in the eye and realize that he had completely lost all of his power. Two massive private security guards employed by the retreat stepped into the suite to flank me. They were highly trained professionals dressed in sharp, dark suits. They gently guided me out of the room and toward the transparent glass elevator that overlooked the main lobby. As the glass car began its smooth descent, I looked down through the floor-to-ceiling windows and witnessed the pathetic spectacle unfolding below. Bradley was standing at the sleek marble reception desk, looking like a frantic, soaked rat. His clothes were damp from the cold Seattle rain, and his face was flushed an ugly shade of red. He was aggressively waving his arms and shouting at the calm professional concierge. I could hear the muffled echoes of his voice carrying upward through the cavernous space. He loudly proclaimed that he was my husband and that he held full medical power of attorney. He demanded that the staff bring me down to the lobby immediately. He yelled that I was mentally unstable and heavily medicated and that he needed to take control of my finances right now. Barbara stood right behind him, nodding aggressively and chiming in to demand respect. She told the concierge that they had flown across the country and were being treated like garbage. Courtney was busy pacing the marble floor, glaring at the wealthy onlookers who were staring at them in blatant disgust. She looked utterly ridiculous, dripping wet in a high-end medical facility, complaining about her ruined vacation. They looked nothing like the wealthy elite they so desperately pretended to be. They looked like loud, desperate grifters. The glass elevator reached the ground floor. The door slid open with a soft melodic chime. The entire lobby fell dead silent. The ambient music seemed to fade away as every single eye turned toward the elevator bank. I stepped forward, pushing my medical walker with slow, deliberate precision. My posture was perfectly straight despite the pain. I wore an elegant silk robe over my medical garments, projecting an image of total calm and absolute authority. Mr. Harrison walked on my right side, holding a thick, formal leather briefcase. The two massive private security guards walked slightly ahead of me, forming an impenetrable human wall between me and my furious husband. Bradley spun around at the sound of the elevator chime. When he saw me descending like a queen holding court, his fake bravado instantly faltered. He took a step forward, intending to march right up to my walker and intimidate me. He opened his mouth to start screaming his demands. He did not even make it 2 steps. The private security guards immediately stepped forward and crossed their arms, blocking his path with their large frames. They stared him down, radiating a silent threat that made Bradley freeze right in his tracks. He realized instantly that he could not bully his way through these men. "Chelsea, tell these security goons to get out of my way," Bradley shouted, his voice echoing terribly in the quiet lobby. He tried to sound commanding, but it came out sounding weak and desperate. "What is wrong with you? We are standing out in the rain because of your little temper tantrum. Tell them to back off and give me your credit card right now so I can pay for my family to have a proper place to sleep." I did not flinch. I did not blink. I simply stared at him with an expression of profound emptiness. I did not need to speak a single word because I had hired someone highly qualified to speak for me. Mr. Harrison stepped smoothly around the security guards and closed the distance between himself and my husband. He reached into his leather briefcase and pulled out a thick, heavy stack of legal documents printed on crisp white paper. He held them out, extending his arm until the papers practically touched Bradley in the chest. Bradley looked at the papers, then looked up at Mr. Harrison with wide, confused eyes. "What is this?" he demanded, refusing to take the stack. "Take the documents, sir," Mr. Harrison instructed, his voice echoing with cold legal authority. Bradley hesitantly raised his hands and took the heavy stack. Mr. Harrison turned slightly, ensuring his voice projected clearly enough for Barbara, Courtney, and every single bystander in the lobby to hear perfectly. He wanted absolute public documentation of this interaction. "My name is Arthur Harrison, and I represent your wife," Mr. Harrison stated plainly. "You have just been legally served. The top document in that stack is a formal filing for the immediate dissolution of your marriage. My client is filing for divorce based on irreconcilable differences and egregious financial misconduct." Bradley physically stumbled backward as if he had been punched in the stomach. The color completely drained from his face, leaving him looking pale and sickly. A collective gasp echoed from the onlookers in the lobby. Barbara clutched her chest, staring at her son in absolute horror. The grand illusion of his perfect, wealthy marriage was being publicly executed. But Mr. Harrison was not finished. The second document you are holding is a court-approved emergency restraining order. Mr. Harrison continued, his tone utterly relentless. Based on your aggressive actions at my client's property earlier this evening, a judge has granted immediate protective status. You are legally forbidden from coming within 500 feet of my client, her corporate office, or her private residential property. If you attempt to contact her or approach this medical facility again, you will be immediately arrested and jailed. Bradley looked down at the papers in his hands, his eyes darting frantically across the dense legal text. His hands began to shake visibly, causing the pages to tremble. He opened his mouth to argue, but he was completely suffocated by his own rising panic. He had marched into this lobby expecting to bully a medicated woman into giving him money. Instead, he was being legally severed from his entire source of wealth and status. And finally, the third document in that stack is a formal civil lawsuit, Mr. Harrison announced, delivering the absolute final blow. We are suing you for $15,000 in property damages. We have the high-definition security footage of you hurling a cast-iron planter through a reinforced glass door at a property you do not legally own. We have already submitted this footage to the local police department to support the felony vandalism charges currently pending against you. You will be held financially responsible for every single cent of the repairs. The absolute devastation in the lobby was palpable. Bradley was completely destroyed. He stood there clutching the divorce papers, the restraining order, and the civil lawsuit, unable to formulate a single coherent thought. He looked absolutely pathetic. All of his arrogance, all of his toxic pride had been systematically dismantled in under 3 minutes in front of a lobby full of wealthy strangers. Barbara looked like she was about to faint. Her dream of a luxury vacation had turned into watching her son get served with a restraining order and a massive lawsuit. She could not even look me in the eye. But Courtney simply could not handle the profound public humiliation. She was a creature of pure vanity, and being embarrassed in front of an audience of affluent onlookers was her absolute worst nightmare. She needed to deflect the shame. She needed to prove that they were still winners in this situation. She needed to salvage whatever tiny scrap of pride they had left. Courtney aggressively shoved her way past her mother and marched up to stand beside her trembling brother. She glared at me, her face twisted into an ugly mask of pure spite. She let out a loud, mocking laugh that sounded completely unhinged in the quiet lobby. "You think you are so smart, Chelsea," Courtney shouted, pointing a manicured finger directly at my face. "You think you are destroying his life with these stupid papers? Well, you are actually doing him a massive favor. We do not need your stupid house, and we definitely do not need your money anyway." She turned to look at the crowd of onlookers, ensuring everyone in the lobby was paying attention to her grand announcement. "Bradley owns a massive logistics startup," Courtney bragged loudly, her voice shrill and desperate. "And his company is officially getting bought out for $12 million this coming Friday. We are going to be millionaires. We are going to be so much richer than you ever were. You are just a boring corporate accountant who is going to end up completely alone. You are going to severely regret throwing us out when you see him walking around with his massive buyout money." Courtney crossed her arms over her chest and smirked triumphantly, fully believing she had just delivered the ultimate devastating insult. She thought she had put me in my place. She thought the knowledge of Bradley impending $12 million fortune would make me cower in regret and beg for forgiveness. I just stood there, resting my hands on my medical walker, and stared directly at my soon-to-be ex-husband. Bradley was not smiling at his sister's grand announcement. He was not puffing out his chest or looking proud. He was staring at me with a look of sudden, absolute terror, because he knew what Courtney did not. He knew that I was a senior corporate auditor. And the chilling smile that slowly spread across my face told him that his nightmare had only just begun. Courtney stood in the center of the upscale medical retreat lobby, breathing heavily after her vicious outburst. She honestly thought she had just dropped the ultimate trump card. She fully expected me to gasp in horror and beg them to forgive me so I could secure a piece of that massive $12 million payout. Instead, I just remained perfectly still, resting my hands lightly on the padded grips of my customized medical walker. I kept my gaze locked entirely on my soon-to-be ex-husband. Bradley had initially been paralyzed by the sheer terror of the divorce papers and the devastating civil lawsuit. But hearing his sister loudly broadcast his impending wealth to the entire room seemed to suddenly reactivate his fragile, inflated ego. He looked at the thick stack of legal documents trembling in his hands and then looked back up at me. I could physically see the precise moment he decided to pivot from absolute panic to supreme blinding arrogance. He straightened his spine and aggressively cleared his throat. He smoothed the lapels of his damp jacket and took a step forward, puffing his chest out like a rooster trying to command a barnyard. The sudden shift in his demeanor was incredibly predictable. He desperately needed to reclaim the high ground in front of his mother, his sister, and the wealthy onlookers lingering in the elegant lobby. He needed to prove that he was the ultimate winner. "Courtney is absolutely right, Chelsea," Bradley announced, his voice growing loud and obnoxiously confident. "You filing these divorce papers tonight is actually the greatest favor you could have ever done for me. My logistics startup is closing a massive acquisition deal this coming Friday. I am walking away with $12 million in pure liquid cash. And because you just formally served me with divorce papers before the final ink is even dry, you are legally cutting yourself out of the biggest financial windfall of my entire life." He let out a sharp, cruel laugh that echoed harshly off the high marble ceilings. He was completely feeding off the sudden surge of his own toxic adrenaline. "You always thought you were so much better than me just because you make a high corporate salary," Bradley sneered, pointing a finger aggressively in my direction. "You constantly held your grandfather and his fancy trust fund over my head like a weapon. You loved making me feel small because my name was not on the deed to that house. Well, guess what, Chelsea? I do not need your stupid house anymore. I do not need your money or your condescending attitude. I built my company from the ground up, completely independent of your assets. You do not own a single share of my business, and my corporate lawyers will make absolutely sure you do not get a single dime of my payout." Barbara nodded eagerly behind him, her face lighting up with a fresh wave of greedy anticipation. She chimed in loudly, telling Bradley that he was going to buy a much bigger and better mansion than mine, and that I was going to regret treating them like garbage. She even patted his shoulder, beaming with toxic maternal pride. "You are just a boring corporate accountant." Bradley continued, his tone dripping with absolute malice. "You sit behind a desk looking at spreadsheets all day, while I am out here building an actual empire. You thought you could lock me out and destroy me tonight, but you just made the biggest financial mistake of your entire pathetic life. I am going to be richer than you ever were, and I am going to make sure everyone in Seattle knows exactly how you ruined our marriage right before I struck it big." I listened to his entire arrogant speech without interrupting him once. I let him dig his grave as deep as he possibly could. I wanted him to climb to the very highest peak of his own delusions, so the eventual fall would be absolutely catastrophic. He had spent years dismissing my career, entirely failing to understand what a senior corporate auditor actually does. He thought I just balanced checkbooks and filed tax returns. He had absolutely no idea the level of corporate power I wielded on a daily basis. The lobby of the medical retreat was completely silent. The affluent bystanders were watching this domestic drama unfold with wide eyes, totally captivated by the raw hostility radiating from my husband. They probably thought I was about to burst into tears or command my lawyer to retract the divorce filing. They probably thought Bradley had actually won the argument and secured his financial dominance. But I did not blink. I did not flinch. I slowly adjusted my grip on the handles of my walker, shifting my weight to relieve the pressure on my fused spine. I looked at the pathetic, angry man standing in front of me and let a chilling, predatory smile spread slowly across my face. I looked directly into Bradley's wide, arrogant eyes. I kept my voice incredibly quiet, but perfectly articulated, ensuring that every single syllable carried through the tense, quiet atmosphere of the luxurious lobby. Are you talking about the impending acquisition by Vanguard Capital? I asked calmly. The reaction was instantaneous and absolutely violent. Bradley's arrogant smirk vanished from his face as if it had been forcefully wiped away by an invisible hand. His mouth fell open and his eyes widened in pure, unadulterated terror. He physically recoiled, taking a sharp, stumbling step backward until his shoulder bumped aggressively into his mother. The silence that followed was suffocating. Bradley was completely paralyzed. He stared at me with an expression of profound, horrifying shock. The blood drained from his cheeks, leaving his face a sickly, ghostly pale. He had never told me the name of the private equity firm that was buying his logistics company. He had kept that information entirely secret, gloating about the payout, but refusing to share the details. The entire buyout deal was currently locked under a strict, legally binding non-disclosure agreement. Absolutely no one outside of his immediate executive team, and the purchasing firm was supposed to know the name Vanguard Capital until the official corporate press release went out on Friday morning. His mind was visibly short-circuiting. He could not comprehend how the name of that highly secretive private equity firm had just effortlessly rolled off my tongue. He knew I was not just throwing out random corporate names. He knew I had just struck the very core of his secret empire. How Bradley choked out, his voice suddenly weak and trembling. He completely dropped the thick stack of legal papers onto the polished marble floor. The crisp white pages scattered everywhere, but he did not even look down to retrieve them. How could you possibly know that name? No one knows that name. You are not allowed to know that name. Courtney and Barbara looked back and forth between us, their faces twisting in deep confusion. They did not understand the severe corporate implications of what was happening. They just saw Bradley suddenly crumbling into a pathetic, terrified mess, and they did not know how to help him. The sudden shift in his demeanor from triumphant king to terrified victim was entirely incomprehensible to them. Bradley! Bradley, what is wrong? Barbara asked nervously, grabbing his arm and shaking it slightly. Why do you look like that? Just ignore her and let us get out of here so you can call your business partner. Bradley ignored his mother completely. He was hyperventilating, his chest heaving under his damp jacket. He realized in that exact moment that the woman he had constantly dismissed as a boring corporate accountant was actually something far more dangerous. He realized that I did not just audit random local businesses. I operated at the absolute highest tier of corporate financial security, investigating multi-million-dollar mergers and acquisitions. He stared at me, waiting for an explanation, waiting for me to tell him it was just a wild, lucky guess. I did not answer his desperate, frantic question. I did not offer him a single word of comfort or explanation. I simply turned my head slightly, shifting my focus entirely away from his terrified face. I looked up at Mr. Harrison, who was standing tall and perfectly composed beside me. I ignored Bradley, panicked, heavy breathing, and spoke loud enough for the entire lobby to hear my final devastating command. Mr. Harrison, I said, my voice ringing with cold, absolute authority. Please contact the executive board of directors at Vanguard Capital first thing tomorrow morning. Let them know that their lead corporate auditor has officially finalized the comprehensive risk assessment on Bradley Logistics firm. Tell them the final report is absolutely devastating and requires their immediate review before Friday. The silence in the lobby of the medical retreat was absolute. Bradley stood frozen, his eyes darting frantically between my face and Mr. Harrison. The name Vanguard Capital hung in the air like a physical weight, completely suffocating the remaining arrogance right out of his lungs. I watched the profound, horrifying realization slowly wash over his pale features. For 5 entire years, he had aggressively dismissed my career. He told his friends I was just a glorified bookkeeper. He told his mother I sat in a cubicle crunching boring tax numbers. He had absolutely no idea that my corporate title meant I was the elite contracted lead auditor for one of the most ruthless private equity firms on the West Coast. He suddenly understood that the highly secretive corporate buyer he had been bragging about was my primary client. He realized that the anonymous, devastating financial risk assessment team that had been tearing through his company ledgers for the past 3 weeks was entirely managed by me. I was the person holding the keys to his massive $12 million payout. I was the gatekeeper to his entire financial future, and he had just spent the last 48 hours trying to steal my house and publicly destroy my reputation. Bradley physically swayed on his feet, his knees buckling slightly under the weight of his impending corporate execution. The massive buyout was the only thing keeping his logistics startup afloat. He had leveraged the company to the breaking point, drowning in high-interest debt, operating entirely on the promise of this Friday acquisition. Without Vanguard Capital, his business was completely worthless. "Chelsea, please!" Bradley stammered, his voice cracking as the sheer magnitude of his mistake crashed down upon him. "You cannot do this. You cannot send that report to the board. This is my entire life. We can figure this out. We can come to an agreement right now." He desperately lunged forward, entirely ignoring me and cornering Mr. Harrison instead. He thought he could negotiate his way out of this disaster like it was a minor contract dispute. He frantically reached out, grabbing the sleeve of my lawyer's jacket, his eyes wide and pleading. "Mr. Harrison, listen to me." Bradley begged, his voice dripping with pure desperation. "I will pay her. I will give Chelsea $50,000 in cash right now if you drop the civil suit for the property damage. I will sign whatever divorce papers you want. Just retract the police report and tear up the restraining order." Vanguard Capital runs their final executive background checks on Friday morning before the signing dinner. If they see a pending civil suit for felony vandalism and an active restraining order, the board will kill the acquisition instantly. I will give you $50,000 to make this disappear. Mr. Harrison calmly reached down and physically peeled Bradley's shaking fingers off his expensive suit jacket. He smoothed his sleeve and looked at my soon-to-be ex-husband with an expression of profound professional disgust. I did not let my lawyer answer. I rested my hands firmly on the padded grips of my medical walker and leaned slightly forward, forcing Bradley to look directly into my eyes. "You do not have $50,000, Bradley," I stated plainly, my voice cutting through his pathetic bargaining. "Your personal accounts are completely empty, and your business accounts are severely overdrawn. You cannot buy your way out of this consequence because you have absolutely nothing to bargain with." "That is not true," Bradley protested weakly, sweat visibly dripping down his temples. "When the buyout clears on Friday, I will have millions. I can pay you double. I can pay you $100,000. You just have to delay the audit report for 3 days. I let out a soft, sharp laugh that echoed in the quiet lobby. The absolute delusion required to beg the auditor you just tried to rob for a fraudulent pass was staggering. "You really believe you built that logistics company entirely by yourself? Do you not?" I asked, my voice dropping to a dangerous steady calm. "You stood there 2 minutes ago and loudly bragged to this entire room that your business was formed completely independent of my assets. You genuinely convinced yourself that you are a self-made man." Bradley blinked rapidly, confusion momentarily piercing through his absolute terror. "I started that company from the ground up," he insisted defensively, glancing back at his mother for validation. "I put in the long hours. I secured the warehouses." "You secured absolutely nothing," I corrected him, slicing through his fabricated history. 4 years ago, when you wanted to launch that startup, every single commercial bank in Seattle rejected your loan applications. Your credit score was abysmal. You had a history of defaulting on your credit cards, and you had absolutely zero viable collateral. You sat on our living room floor crying because the bank told you your business plan was too risky. Barbara opened her mouth to interrupt, ready to defend her golden child, but I held up a single finger, silencing her instantly. I was not finished dismantling his ego. "You only secured that initial $1 million small business loan because I secretly co-signed the master agreement," I revealed, watching the blood drain completely from Bradley's face. "I used the capital from my irrevocable trust fund to financially guarantee your entire corporate existence. I assumed all of the risk so you could play the role of the big successful founder. I literally bought your seat at the table. But your fragile, pathetic ego could not handle the reality of a woman funding your dreams. So you forced yourself to forget. You completely erased my financial backing from your memory so you could stand around at dinner parties and brag about being a self-made corporate giant." Bradley stared at me, his mouth opening and closing without producing a single sound. The wealthy onlookers in the lobby were completely captivated by the brutal, undeniable truth of his exposure. He had built his entire identity on a foundation of my money, and now he was watching that foundation crumble into dust. "I am not taking your $50,000 bribe, Bradley," I stated, my tone absolutely final. "And I am not delaying the risk assessment report. The audit file is already sealed certified and waiting on the desk of the Vanguard Capital Chief Executive Officer. You are going to face the board of directors on Friday, and you are going to answer for every single financial discrepancy I found in your ledgers." I signaled to my private security guards. They instantly stepped forward, forming a protective barrier around my medical walker. Mr. Harrison picked up his leather briefcase, giving Bradley one last look of absolute pity. "We are done here," I announced to the silent lobby. "Do not attempt to contact me again, Bradley. Speak only to my lawyer or speak to the police. The choice is entirely yours." I turned my medical walker around with slow, deliberate precision. I did not look back as I walked toward the secure private wing of the recovery retreat. I left Bradley, Barbara, and Courtney standing completely paralyzed in the center of the upscale lobby, their grand illusions of wealth and dominance entirely shattered. The next 48 hours passed in a blur of intense, satisfying silence. I remained in my luxurious recovery suite, receiving world-class physical therapy and monitoring the seamless transfer of my remaining personal assets. My phone remained blissfully quiet, completely insulated from the toxic chaos of my soon-to-be ex-husband and his greedy relatives. But Bradley did not surrender. He was entirely incapable of accepting defeat. His massive ego simply would not allow him to comprehend the absolute reality of his corporate execution. He convinced himself that he could still salvage the $12 million acquisition. He genuinely believed that his natural charm and fast-talking sales pitches could overcome a certified, devastating audit report from a senior corporate risk assessor. He thought he could walk into the final signing dinner on Friday night and simply bluff his way through the financial discrepancies. Friday evening finally arrived. The relentless Seattle rain had cleared, leaving a crisp, cold night in its wake. Bradley, fueled by pure, unadulterated delusion, decided to proceed with his grand celebration plans. He wanted to project an image of supreme confidence and unlimited wealth to his mother, his sister, and the 7 extended relatives who were still crammed into the miserable, cheap roadside motel. He forced them to dress in their absolute best formal attire. He rented 3 luxury black car services on a high-interest corporate account to transport them from the industrial outskirts of the city directly to downtown Seattle. He was determined to host a massive premature celebration dinner at the most exclusive Michelin-star steakhouse in the entire metropolitan area. I monitored the activity through the joint credit monitoring alerts I still had access to. Bradley marched his 9 hungry, expectant relatives into the opulent, dimly lit private dining room of the steakhouse. He aggressively ordered multiple bottles of vintage champagne, the most expensive reserve caviar, and premium dry-aged steaks for the entire table. He was toasting to his own brilliance, laughing loudly, and assuring his mother that the Vanguard Capital executives were going to walk through the restaurant doors at any moment to hand him a $12 million check. He put the entire $4,000 dinner bill directly onto his dying, maxed-out business credit card. He was racking up massive corporate debt just hours before his company was scheduled to be officially acquired, completely ignoring the strict spending freeze mandated by the acquisition contract. He was sitting at the head of the long mahogany table, holding his crystal champagne flute high in the air, grinning like a man who had conquered the entire world. He thought he had successfully outsmarted me. He thought the devastating audit report was just a minor hurdle he could easily jump over with a few excuses. He was waiting eagerly for the private equity executives to arrive so he could sign the final papers and finally secure his absolute victory. He was completely blinded by his own toxic arrogance, sipping his expensive champagne and basking in the false adoration of his greedy, entitled family members. He had absolutely no idea what was about to walk through those heavy mahogany double doors. The atmosphere inside the private dining room of the Michelin-star steakhouse was absolutely electric, thick with the intoxicating scent of dry-aged beef and the overwhelming stench of unearned arrogance. Bradley sat at the very head of the massive mahogany table, desperately trying to project the image of a victorious, untouchable corporate titan. He had spared absolutely no expense for this premature victory lap. The long table was completely covered in extravagant luxuries. Silver towers of crushed ice displayed the most expensive reserve caviar. Crystal flutes brimmed with vintage champagne that cost hundreds of dollars per bottle. Bradley had aggressively put the entire $4,000 bill directly onto his dying maxed-out business credit card. He was racking up massive corporate debt just hours before his company was scheduled to be officially acquired, completely ignoring the strict spending freeze mandated by his acquisition contract. He was terrified, but his toxic ego refused to let him cancel the dinner. He genuinely believed that his natural charm and fast-talking sales pitches could somehow overcome a certified devastating audit report. He thought he could walk into this final signing dinner, flash his charismatic smile, and simply bluff his way through the massive financial discrepancies I had uncovered. To his right, his mother Barbara was practically vibrating with greedy anticipation. She held her delicate crystal champagne flute high in the air, the expensive bubbly liquid sloshing over the rim, as she laughed loudly at her own jokes. She was wearing a brand new designer dress, likely purchased on a high-interest credit card she fully expected her son to pay off by Monday morning. She leaned across the table, her face flushed with alcohol and malicious triumph. "I cannot believe Chelsea actually filed those divorce papers," Barbara cackled, taking a large gulp of her champagne. She has always been completely rigid and totally clueless, but cutting herself out of your life right before you secure a $12 million payout is a special kind of stupid. She is probably sitting in that sterile medical clinic right now, crying her eyes out because she realizes she just threw away a massive fortune. "We are going to buy a house twice the size of hers, Bradley, and we are going to make sure she sees every single picture of it." Courtney, sitting directly across from her mother, nodded eagerly in enthusiastic agreement. She was busy adjusting the lighting on her smartphone, trying to capture the perfect aesthetic angle of the caviar and the champagne bottles for her social media followers. She wanted everyone online to know that she was currently dining with Seattle's newest multimillionaire. "She really thought she had the upper hand when she locked us out of the house," Courtney sneered, not bothering to look up from her glowing screen. She thought she was so incredibly powerful, sitting on that pathetic medical walker in the lobby. But she is just a bitter, boring accountant who could never appreciate a real entrepreneur like you. "I cannot wait to post the pictures of you signing the final acquisition papers tonight. The look on her face when she sees we won is going to be absolutely priceless." Bradley forced a tight, artificial smile, raising his own glass to meet theirs. He was trying desperately to bask in the false adoration of his greedy, entitled family members, but a cold, heavy knot of dread was twisting violently in his stomach. He kept nervously checking the heavy gold watch on his wrist, his eyes darting repeatedly toward the thick mahogany double doors at the entrance of the private dining room. The Vanguard Capital executives were exactly 5 minutes late. In the high-stakes world of private equity acquisitions, 5 minutes was an eternity. He took a nervous, gulping sip of his champagne, trying to wash down the dry, scratchy panic building in his throat. He kept silently repeating his fabricated excuses in his head, convincing himself that he could easily explain away the missing funds, the doctored ledgers, and the blatant embezzlement I had meticulously documented in my final audit report. He thought the private equity firm wanted his logistics technology so desperately that they would willingly overlook a few creative accounting errors. He was completely blinded by his own towering delusions. Suddenly, the heavy brass handles of the mahogany double doors clicked sharply. The ambient, cheerful chatter in the private dining room instantly ceased. Barbara hastily set her champagne flute down on the crisp white tablecloth, smoothing her hair and sitting up perfectly straight. Courtney immediately locked the screen of her smartphone, turning her full, eager attention toward the entrance. Bradley stood up from his chair at the head of the table, hastily buttoning his tailored suit jacket and plastering his absolute best, most confident executive smile onto his pale face. The door swung open slowly, revealing the senior executive team from Vanguard Capital. There were 3 men in total, all dressed in immaculate, custom-tailored dark suits. They stepped into the opulent dining room, bringing an incredibly cold, severe energy that instantly shattered the warm, celebratory atmosphere. They did not look like men arriving to hand over a massive $12 million check. They did not carry bottles of celebratory wine or offer warm, enthusiastic greetings. They looked like grim, silent executioners stepping into a courtroom to deliver a final, devastating verdict. Bradley's artificial smile wavered slightly, but he aggressively pushed through his rising panic. He stepped out from behind the head of the table, extending his right hand in a grand, welcoming gesture. "Gentlemen," Bradley announced, his voice carrying a forced, overly enthusiastic, hearty tone. "Welcome. I took the liberty of ordering the reserve champagne and some excellent appetizers to get the celebration started. Please come in and take a seat. We have a lot to toast to tonight." The chief executive officer of Vanguard Capital, a tall, imposing man with sharp gray eyes, did not step forward to accept the handshake. He did not look at the expensive champagne or the towering displays of caviar. He stood perfectly still, just inside the doorway, his hands resting casually at his sides, and stared at Bradley with an expression of profound, chilling disgust. The silence that stretched across the dining room was heavy, suffocating, and entirely devoid of any professional courtesy. Barbara and Courtney exchanged nervous, confused glances, their greedy smiles slowly melting away as the severe tension in the room became absolutely undeniable. Bradley lowered his extended hand, the remaining color draining completely from his face. He swallowed hard, his throat bobbing visibly above his tight collar. "Is there a problem with the final contracts?" Bradley stammered, his confident executive facade cracking under the CEO's relentless, silent stare. "We can easily go over any minor details right now before we sign. I am completely open to discussing the terms." The CEO of Vanguard Capital finally spoke, his voice deep, quiet, and completely devoid of any warmth. "We are not here to sign any contracts tonight, Bradley," the CEO stated plainly, his words hitting the room like drops of freezing water. "And we are certainly not here to celebrate. We are here because our lead corporate risk assessor insisted on delivering the final audit findings directly to you in person." Bradley's entire body went rigid. His eyes widened in pure, unadulterated terror as the CEO took a slow, deliberate step to the left, clearing the main entryway of the dining room. The heavy mahogany doors swung open slightly wider. I stepped into the room. I was not sitting on a medical walker anymore. I was standing tall, leaning elegantly on a sleek black medical cane. I wore a perfectly tailored dark charcoal business suit that accommodated my rigid back brace while projecting an image of absolute untouchable authority. My hair was pulled back into a sharp professional style, and my expression was entirely stripped of any emotion. I was not a wounded wife or a recovering surgical patient. I was the apex predator of the corporate financial world, arriving to deliver a fatal strike. The entire family fell completely dead silent. The shock that radiated through the room was so intense it felt almost physical. Barbara let out a short, strangled gasp, her hand flying up to cover her mouth in absolute horror. Courtney stared at me with wide, unblinking eyes, her brain completely unable to process the reality of my presence alongside these powerful executives. Bradley looked like he was going to physically collapse. He gripped the edge of the mahogany table with white knuckles, his chest heaving under his expensive suit jacket, as his worst, most terrifying nightmare materialized right in front of his eyes. I did not offer a greeting. I did not smile or acknowledge the stunned relatives sitting frozen in their chairs. I walked forward with slow, deliberate, powerful steps, the rubber tip of my medical cane striking the polished hardwood floor with a rhythmic, intimidating thud. The executives from Vanguard Capital respectfully parted, creating a clear, unobstructed path for me to approach the table. They deferred to my authority, entirely standing back to let me execute the final maneuver. I walked the entire length of the private dining room, passing by the expensive champagne and the lavish appetizers, until I stood directly in front of Bradley at the head of the table. I looked him dead in the eye, watching the sheer, suffocating panic swimming in his pupils. He was entirely stripped of his power, his pride, and his pathetic delusions. I raised my left hand and placed a thick, bright red audit file directly onto his empty, pristine porcelain dinner plate. The heavy sound of the dense folder hitting the porcelain echoed loudly in the silent room. I kept my gaze locked intensely on his terrified face, making sure he understood the absolute finality of this exact moment. I let the silence hang in the air for a long, agonizing few seconds before I finally spoke, my voice ringing out with cold, devastating clarity. "Your audit is completely finalized, Bradley," I stated softly, ensuring every single person in the room heard the lethal weight of my words. "And I suggest you do not bother ordering dessert. You are going to need every single cent of your remaining credit limit to pay for your criminal defense attorney." I kept my gaze locked on Bradley as the heavy silence stretched across the opulent private dining room. The bright red audit file rested perfectly in the center of his pristine porcelain dinner plate, a fatal bomb waiting to detonate. Bradley stared at the folder as if it were a venomous snake. His chest heaved beneath his expensive tailored suit. He tried to open his mouth to speak, but his throat was completely dry. At the far end of the long mahogany table, Barbara and Courtney were completely frozen in their plush leather chairs. Their crystal champagne flutes were still resting in their trembling hands, but the celebratory mood had been violently executed. They looked back and forth between me and the grim Vanguard Capital executives standing silently behind me. They simply could not process how the woman they had mocked and tried to render homeless was currently commanding a room full of powerful billionaires. They had spent the entire evening mocking my intelligence, and now they were trapped in a room where I held absolute authority. I did not give Bradley the chance to formulate a pathetic lie. I reached forward with my free hand and flipped open the thick cover of the red audit file. The crisp white pages inside were covered in highlighted spreadsheets, flagged invoices, and devastating financial summaries. Every single page represented a nail in the coffin of his fraudulent empire. I turned my head slightly to address the chief executive officer of Vanguard Capital, who was standing respectfully to my left. "As the lead risk assessor for your firm, I have concluded the comprehensive deep dive into the financial ledgers of this logistics startup," I stated clearly, my voice echoing off the expensive wood-paneled walls. "What was presented to your board of directors as a thriving, highly profitable enterprise is in reality a hollow shell company drowning in high-interest debt and massive unrecorded liabilities." Bradley physically flinched. He reached out a trembling hand toward the folder, but I smoothly pulled it out of his reach. He knew exactly what those pages contained. "Chelsea." "Please," Bradley whispered, his voice cracking with pure terror. "Please do not do this right now. We can talk about this privately. Just give me 5 minutes to explain." I ignored his pathetic begging entirely. I looked directly at his mother and his sister, ensuring they understood exactly how their unearned luxury was about to be ripped away from them. They needed to hear exactly where their glamorous lifestyle had come from. This company did not generate the projected revenue outlined in the acquisition prospectus. I continued projecting my voice to command the entire room. Instead, the founder has spent the last 3 years systematically cooking the books. He engaged in aggressive, fraudulent accounting practices to artificially inflate the company valuation while simultaneously embezzling hundreds of thousands of dollars in operating capital. Barbara gasped, dropping her champagne flute. The delicate crystal shattered against the expensive hardwood floor, spilling expensive wine everywhere. Embezzling Barbara shrieked, her face turning a sickly shade of gray. "My son is a legitimate entrepreneur. You are just a bitter, vindictive woman making up vicious lies to ruin his big night because you are jealous of his success." I did not raise my voice or react to her desperate insult. I simply looked down at the first page of the audit report and began reading the undeniable forensic proof. On September 14th of last year, a corporate wire transfer of $40,000 was executed from the primary logistics operating account, I read, calmly tracing the printed line with my index finger. It was improperly categorized as an emergency warehouse expansion fee. However, I traced the routing numbers directly to a luxury beachfront resort in Cabo San Lucas. Courtney suddenly stopped breathing. Her eyes widened in absolute horror as the realization hit her. The blood rushed out of her face, leaving her looking terrified and small. That exact $40,000 transfer completely funded your lavish destination wedding, Courtney, I stated, looking directly at my arrogant sister-in-law. Your brother stole operating capital from his investors to pay for your floral arrangements, your oceanfront suite, and your premium open bar. You bragged online about how generous he was, but he was just playing rich with stolen money. Courtney shrank back into her leather chair, looking around the room as if searching for an escape route. The Vanguard executive stared at her with expressions of profound professional disgust. She was suddenly realizing that she was implicated in a major corporate crime. I turned the page of the audit file, moving relentlessly to the next piece of devastating evidence. In February of this year, a series of structured payments totaling $65,000 were funneled through a dummy vendor account labeled as Fleet Vehicle Maintenance. I read, my eyes shifting to Barbara. Those funds were actually used to purchase a luxury imported sports utility vehicle registered directly in the name of Barbara. Barbara covered her mouth with both hands, her face flushing a deep, shameful red. She had spent months driving that vehicle around her neighborhood, bragging to her friends about how her wealthy, successful son had bought it for her out of pure generosity. Now she was sitting in a room full of corporate executives, realizing she was driving a stolen vehicle purchased with embezzled corporate funds. She looked absolutely humiliated. And the list goes on. I continued flipping through page after page of highlighted financial crimes. $10,000 drained from the employee payroll tax fund to cover a family vacation to the Bahamas categorized as an executive wellness retreat. Thousands of dollars in luxury dinners, high-end clothing, and personal club memberships, all fraudulently written off as legitimate business expenses. This company is a financial house of cards built entirely on stolen money and massive corporate fraud. Bradley buried his face in his hands, letting out a loud, pathetic sob. The reality of his total destruction had finally broken his fragile ego. He was not a corporate titan. He was a petty thief who had stolen from his own business to buy the shallow respect of his greedy mother and sister. He wept openly at the head of the table, the expensive dry-aged steak growing cold on his plate. The chief executive officer of Vanguard Capital stepped forward. He did not look angry. He looked completely cold and entirely ruthless. He buttoned his custom suit jacket and looked down at the pathetic, weeping man sitting at the head of the table. Vanguard Capital has a strict zero-tolerance policy for financial misconduct, the CEO stated, his voice ringing with absolute finality. Based on the conclusive forensic evidence provided by our lead auditor, this acquisition is formally and entirely canceled. We will be withdrawing all financial offers immediately. Furthermore, we will be submitting a complete copy of this audit report to our corporate legal team to pursue damages regarding the time and resources you have wasted. The massive $12 million buyout, the entire foundation of Bradley's arrogant identity, evaporated into thin air. He had absolutely nothing left. His personal accounts were drained, his business was bankrupt, his massive credit card debt was coming due. Barbara and Courtney sat frozen at the lavish dinner table, completely paralyzed by the catastrophic fallout. They had walked into this restaurant expecting to become instant millionaires. They had spent the entire evening mocking me and celebrating their impending wealth. Now they were sitting in front of cold luxury caviar, realizing they were entirely complicit in a massive corporate embezzlement scheme. They had absolutely no way to pay for the extravagant dinner they were currently eating. But the absolute final blow did not come from me or the Vanguard executives. Sitting halfway down the long mahogany table was Bradley's business partner. He was a quiet, brilliant technical developer who had poured 5 years of his life into building the logistics software. He had trusted Bradley to handle the finances while he managed the engineering department. He had arrived at this dinner expecting to sign away his equity for a life-changing payout. He had dressed in his best suit and brought his wife to celebrate. Instead, he had just listened to me methodically prove that his trusted partner had stolen all their operating capital to buy luxury cars and fun beach weddings. The business partner slowly stood up from his chair. His face was completely devoid of color, looking almost translucent in the dim restaurant lighting. His hands were shaking so violently he had to grip the edge of the heavy mahogany table just to steady himself. Bradley, the partner, whispered, his voice trembling with a mixture of profound betrayal and blinding rage. "You told me we were missing our quarterly targets because of supply chain issues. You told me we had to cut employee benefits because the market was tight. And you were stealing our money to pay for your sister wedding." Bradley slowly raised his head, his eyes red and puffy from crying. He reached out a trembling hand toward his partner, trying to form a pathetic excuse. "I was going to pay it back," he choked out, wiping his nose on his expensive sleeve. "The buyout was going to cover everything. I just needed to borrow it for a little while to keep my family happy. I swear I was going to replace the funds." The partner slapped Bradley hand away with a vicious, forceful strike. The sharp sound echoed like a gunshot in the quiet dining room, causing Barbara to flinch violently in her seat. "You ruined my life," the partner shouted, his voice finally breaking completely. "I mortgaged my house for this company. I drained my kids' college funds to keep the servers running because you swore we were broke. You are an absolute thief and a liar." The partner reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out his cell phone. He did not look at the Vanguard executives, and he did not look at me. He kept his furious, burning gaze locked entirely on the man who had destroyed his entire future. "I'm calling our corporate attorneys right now," the partner announced, his voice rising in volume until he was practically screaming. "And then I am calling the federal authorities. I am turning over every single hard drive in the office to the fraud division. I am pressing full federal charges against you for corporate fraud and embezzlement. You are going to federal prison, Bradley, and I am going to make absolutely sure you rot there." Bradley let out a horrific, desperate wail. He slid out of his chair and physically dropped to his knees on the restaurant floor. He reached out and grabbed his partner by the pant leg, begging and pleading for mercy. He sobbed that he could not go to prison, that he would find a way to pay back every single cent if they just gave him a few more weeks. The partner violently kicked his leg free, stepping back in absolute disgust. He turned his back on the weeping, pathetic man on the floor and marched directly out of the private dining room, hitting the call button on his phone as he pushed through the heavy mahogany doors. Bradley remained crumpled on the expensive hardwood floor of the private dining room. The heavy mahogany doors had just swung shut behind his furious business partner, but the echoes of his impending federal prosecution still hung thickly in the air. The absolute destruction of his entire world was complete. I stood by the table, leaning comfortably on my medical cane, and watched as the reality of the situation finally penetrated the greedy, delusional minds of my mother-in-law and sister-in-law. For a moment, Barbara and Courtney just sat frozen in their plush leather chairs. Their eyes darted from the crying man on the floor to the cold, unforgiving faces of the Vanguard Capital executives. Then the realization hit them. There would be no $12 million payout. There would be no sprawling mansions or luxury vacations. Instead, there were only maxed-out credit cards, stolen vehicles, and imminent federal investigations. The sudden, violent shift in their loyalty was absolutely breathtaking to witness. Barbara abruptly pushed her chair back, the wooden legs scraping harshly against the floor. She did not rush to her sobbing son to offer him maternal comfort. She did not kneel beside him to hold his hand. Instead, she stood over him, her face twisting into a mask of pure, vicious rage. "You absolute fool!" Barbara shrieked, her shrill voice shattering whatever quiet remained in the restaurant. "How could you be so incredibly stupid? You told us we were rich. You told me that car was a gift. Now you have the federal authorities coming after us. You ruined my life. How am I supposed to show my face in my neighborhood when they come to repossess my vehicle?" Courtney jumped up right behind her mother, throwing her expensive linen napkin onto her plate of uneaten caviar. She looked completely unhinged. The glamorous social media influencer facade was entirely gone, replaced by blind, terrifying panic. "My credit cards are completely maxed out because of you," Courtney screamed, pointing a trembling finger down at her brother. "I booked non-refundable trips. I bought designer clothes for this new lifestyle you promised us. You are a complete failure, Bradley. You are going to prison, and you are dragging us down with you. You lied to us. You promised me I would never have to work again." Bradley looked up at them with red, swollen eyes. He reached out a hand toward his mother, desperately seeking the unconditional support she had always falsely promised him. "Mom, please." He choked out his voice, a pathetic whimper. "I was doing it for us. I wanted to give you the life you deserved. I need your help. I do not have a lawyer. I do not have anything. Do not you dare ask me for anything." Barbara spat, taking a disgusted step backward, as if he were carrying a contagious disease. "I am not going down for your corporate crimes. You are on your own." The sheer toxicity of their family dynamic was fully exposed. They had only ever loved what he could provide for them. The second the money evaporated, their unconditional family loyalty vanished into thin air. They devoured each other like starving wolves. But their vicious anger quickly morphed into a new, far more pathetic emotion: desperation. Courtney looked around the room, her eyes wide and frantic. She realized that they were currently stranded in an upscale downtown restaurant. They had no money, no hotel room, and absolutely no way to pay the massive debts waiting for them back home. Slowly, her panicked gaze landed directly on me. I watched the gears turning in her selfish, calculating mind. She swallowed hard, her previous arrogance completely dissolving into sheer desperation. She took a hesitant step toward me, forcing a wavering, artificial smile onto her face. "Chelsea," Courtney began, her voice trembling as she clasped her hands together in a begging motion. "Chelsea, listen, we were wrong. We were so completely wrong about everything. Bradley lied to us. He manipulated us into turning against you. We had absolutely no idea he was doing all these terrible things behind your back." Barbara immediately caught on to her daughter's tactic. She rushed forward, standing beside Courtney, nodding her head vigorously. Her eyes were suddenly wide and pleading, shedding tears of pure desperation. "Yes, Chelsea, please," Barbara cried out, reaching a hand toward my arm, though she did not dare actually touch me. "We are victims in this too. He completely deceived us. You are such a smart, capable woman. You have always been the strong one. We are completely stranded out here. We have nowhere to go and no money for a hotel. Please, Chelsea, can we just come back and stay at your house? Just for a few nights until we figure things out. We promise we will be quiet. We will stay out of your way." The absolute audacity of their request was staggering. Less than 2 hours ago, they were standing in the lobby of my medical retreat, loudly mocking my surgery and bragging about how they were going to be richer than I ever was. Now, facing total ruin, they were pathetic beggars, asking to sleep under the very roof they had actively conspired to steal from me. I looked at the two women standing before me. I looked at the man weeping on the floor. I felt absolutely nothing for any of them. No anger, no pity, no lingering resentment. They were just empty, hollow people who had finally reached the inevitable conclusion of their own greedy choices. I adjusted my grip on my medical cane and stood perfectly straight. I looked Barbara directly in the eye, my expression completely cold and entirely unyielding. "You belong exactly where you are right now," I stated calmly, my voice steady and resolute. "You belong with absolutely nothing. You conspired to drug me. You tried to steal my home while I was trapped in a medical bed. You cheered while your son hurled a cast-iron planter through my glass door. You do not get to play the victim just because your malicious plans violently backfired." Barbara flinched, her mouth opening and closing silently. Courtney let out a small, pathetic sob, realizing that her manipulation tactics were entirely useless against me. "You can figure things out on the street." I continued, delivering my final, chilling rejection. "Do not ever attempt to contact me again." I turned my back on them. I did not look at Bradley one last time. I simply nodded to the chief executive officer of Vanguard Capital, who gave me a respectful, deeply impressed nod in return. We walked together toward the heavy mahogany double doors. The private security guards opened them for us, clearing our path out of the toxic wreckage. As I stepped through the doors, I paused and glanced briefly at the restaurant manager, who was standing nearby, watching the chaotic scene with wide eyes. "Just so you are aware," I told the manager, politely, "the gentleman crying on the floor is responsible for the entire $4,000 dinner bill. I highly suggest you run his credit card before the federal authorities officially freeze his accounts." I walked out of the restaurant, stepping into the crisp, cool Seattle night. I climbed into the back of my waiting private car, leaving my toxic past entirely behind me. 6 months later, the dark, rainy winter had fully transitioned into a bright, beautiful Seattle summer. My physical recovery had been a long, demanding journey, but I had poured every ounce of my discipline into my daily physical therapy. The rigid plastic back brace was completely gone. I no longer needed the customized metal walker or the sleek black cane. I was fully recovered from my L4 to L5 spinal fusion. I was walking tall, moving with effortless grace, and living completely pain-free for the first time in years. I had officially finalized the sale of the sprawling suburban house. I had zero desire to live in a space tainted by the memory of Bradley and his greedy relatives. The real estate market was incredibly strong, and the property sold for a massive multi-million-dollar profit. I took those funds and invested them exactly where they belonged. In myself. I formally resigned from my corporate auditing job and used the capital from the house sale to open my own elite boutique risk assessment firm. My reputation had skyrocketed after the Vanguard Capital incident. The CEO had been so profoundly impressed by my ruthless, meticulous execution of the logistics audit that he immediately signed my new firm to a massive exclusive retainer contract. Other high-net-worth clients quickly followed suit. Bradley's life had gone exactly as I predicted. Without my money to shield him, he faced the full devastating force of the federal justice system. He was currently awaiting sentencing for multiple counts of corporate fraud and embezzlement. Barbara and Courtney had been forced to declare bankruptcy. Drowning in insurmountable credit card debt and legal fees, they had to abandon their lavish fantasies and move back to their small hometown in absolute public disgrace. I stood in the center of my sleek, brand-new corner office, located on the 40th floor of a premier downtown high-rise. The afternoon sun poured through the floor-to-ceiling windows, casting a warm, golden glow across my custom glass desk. I was the sole founder, the absolute boss, and the master of my own life. I walked over to the massive glass window and looked out at the vibrant city below. The faint, ghostly reflection of my own face stared back at me in the glass. I looked stronger, sharper, and more alive than I ever had before. I reached my hand behind my back, my fingers lightly tracing the soft fabric of my tailored suit jacket, right over the spot where the faint silver scar rested on my lower spine. The surgery was supposed to make me weak. It was supposed to leave me vulnerable, helpless, and completely at the mercy of a man who wanted to destroy me. But Bradley had fundamentally misunderstood who I was. That surgery did not break me. It gave me the spine I needed to finally stand up, cut the dead weight from my life, and build an empire entirely on my own terms.